Hey, welcome back. Esoteric Duvidism here. Continuing with my studies, almost wrapping up the science aspect, and maybe I'll have a few more after that on more history, religion, and I just want to solidify, ground my wisdom and my knowledge. And largely this is just my own personal research, so unlikely I'm publishing anytime soon or anything like that. So this is just a live display of my public research. I'm enjoying doing it, and I hope I see a few people have been joining me regularly. Hopefully they're gaining from it. So I'm going to switch to screen share and get started right away. And if anyone saw yesterday, I read through those articles on the brain as a predictive machine, which to some extent was the whole point of all the prior stuff that I'd done, was to get to that research. And very happy I did. Very powerful information. I definitely feel my understanding of these subjects is at the height that it's ever been. So let's jump right in. Emotions. Emotions, a complex psychophysical process that arises from spontaneous, involuntary, rather than through conscious effort, evokes physiological response, negative or positive, and physical expressions related to feelings, perceptions, or beliefs in reality or in imagination. Emotion is often defined as a complex state of feeling that results in physical and psychological changes that influence thought, behavior, and action. There are two basic emotions that we all experience: love and fear. All other emotions are variations of these two emotions. So emotions derive from the basic drives that all animals share: feeding, sex, reproduction, pleasure, pain, fear, aggression. Human emotions are largely learned and include affection, pride, guilt, pity, envy, and resentment. Brain areas related to emotion. Emotions are thought to be related to activity in the brain areas that direct our attention, motivate our behavior, and determine the significance of what is going on around us. So you have Broca in 1878 and Pappas and McLean 1952 suggested emotion is related to the limbic system, which include the hypothalamus, cingulate cortex, hippocampi, and other structures. So emotions are represented in the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, namely the amygdala. Lesion of the left prefrontal area produces depression. Lesion of the right prefrontal produces laughter and euphoria. So emotion is a term that describes subjective and conscious experiences characterized primarily by psychophysiological expressions, biological reactions, mental states. Emotions are influenced by hormones such as cortisol and oxytocin and neurotransmitters like serotonin. Some basic emotions. So, classification of emotions, two fundamental viewpoints. First, emotions are discrete and fundamentally different constructs. And second, emotions are dimensional and groupings. So distinction is made between emotional episodes and emotional dispositions. Emotional dispositions are also comparable to character traits. So you have somatic theories, cognitive theories, evolutionary perspective on emotion. Somatic theories, William James, believe that emotional experience is largely due to the experience of bodily changes, visceral, postural, and facial expressive. James Lang theory, a change situation leads to a change of bodily state, which in turn gives rise to an emotion. Walter Cannon and Bard, emotion is produced when an appropriate stimulus is perceived by the thalamus, which in turn activates part of the cerebral cortex concerned with emotional experience and causes the physiological changes in the periphery. So you have the Singer-Schachter theory, two-factor theory, emotional experience were the result of physiological arousal, which is undifferentiated, and cognitions, which are different in different emotions. In cognitive theories, Lazarus theory, emotion is a disturbance that occurs in the following order: cognitive appraisal, the individual assesses the event cognitively, which cues the emotion; physiological changes, the cognitive reaction starts biological changes such as increased heart rate or pituitary adrenal response; and action, the individual feels the emotion and chooses how to react. So evolutionary perspective, 1870s, Darwin proposed that emotions evolved because they had adaptive value. Fear evolved because it helped people act in a way that enhanced their chance of survival. Darwin believed that facial expressions of emotion are innate. Facial expressions allow people to quickly judge someone's hostility or friendliness and to communicate intentions to others. So human cultures share several primary emotions, including happiness, content, surprise, disgust, anger, fear, and sadness, and believe that all other emotions result from blends and different intensities of these primary emotions. So terror, for example, is a more intense form of the primary emotion of fear. So you have primary emotions and secondary emotions. So primary emotions are innate emotions such as fear, depend on limbic system circuity, with the amygdala and anterior cingulate gyrus being key players. Robert Putchik described 8 primary emotions: anger, sadness, disgust, curiosity, fear, joy, surprise, and acceptance. Similar to the way that primary colors are combined, primary emotions are believed to blend together to form the full spectrum of human emotional experience. Secondary emotions. Feelings attached to objects, events, and situations through learning require additional input based largely on memory from the prefrontal and somosensory cortices. The stimulus is analyzed in the thought process. Thoughts and emotions are interwoven. Every thought almost always carries with it an emotional response. So emotion has multiple dimensions: behavioral expressions, physiological arousal, subjective feeling, conscious experience, and cognitive. The physical responses for different emotions: fear is felt as a heightened heartbeat, increased flinch response, and increased muscle tension. Anger, based on sensation, seems indistinguishable from fear. Happiness is often felt as an expansive or swelling feeling in the chest, and the sensation of lightness or buoyancy as if standing underwater. Sadness often experiences feeling of tightness in the throat and eyes, and relaxation of the arms and legs. Shame can be felt as heat in the upper chest and face, and desire can be accompanied by a dry throat, heavy breathing, and increased heart rate. So emotions are experienced as either positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant. Emotions do not seem to be neutral. So psychotherapy proposes that distressing emotions are relieved by emotional discharge, hence crying, laughing, sweating, shaking, and trembling. Those actions commonly associated emotions are thought to not be the original sensations, but instead merely aromatic responses that dispel the discomfort of disturbing feelings. Okay. Nice quick overview. So let's look at some animal cognition ones. So we got animal cognition. Animal cognition is the study of the processes used to generate adaptive or flexible behavior in animal species. In the context of animal cognition research, cognition usually refers to the cognitive mechanisms involved in learning, memory, perception, and decision-making. As a part of cognitive science, research in animal cognition aims to uncover the different cognitive mechanisms at play across species, with the purpose of understanding the varieties of cognition, the similarities between humans and other species, and the evolution and function of cognitive processes. So background assumption is the computational theory of mind. Cognition is a general purpose computation system, whereas cognition modular. Cognition must be thought of as a bundle of special purpose computation modules rather than one general purpose processor. So animal minds from the historical perspective, Aristotle defined human as the rational animal, thus rejecting the possibility that any other species is rational. St. Thomas Aquinas believed that animals are rational because they are not free. René Descartes defended a distinction between humans and animals based on the belief that language is a necessary condition for mind. On his view, animals are soulless machines. Kant concluded that since they cannot think about themselves, animals are not rational agents, and hence they only have instrumental value. Voltaire criticized Descartes' view that humans, but not animals, have souls and hence minds by suggesting that there is no evidence for the claim. And David Hume was downright dismissive of the animal mind skeptics when he wrote, "Next to the riddle of denying an evident truth is that of taking much pains to defend it, and no truth appears to me more evident than that beasts are endowed with thought and reason as well as man. The arguments are in this case so obvious that they never escape the most stupid and ignorant." So why do our animals have mind? The argument from analogy for animal minds: all animals I already know to have a mind have property X. Individuals species Y have property X, therefore individuals species Y probably have a mind. The reference property could be any number of things, such as a general capacity, problem solving, a specific ability like language theory, mind tool use, a behavior, even brain activity. So why do animals have mind? the inference to the best explanation argument. Individuals of species X engage in behaviors Y. The best scientific explanation for an individual engaging in behaviors Y is that it has a mind, therefore it is likely that individuals of species X have minds. The inference to the best explanation argument justifies the attribution of mental states to animals based on the robust predictive and explanatory power that is gained from such attributions. As the argument goes, without such attributions, we would be unable to make sense of animal behavior. This argument relies on ordinary scientific reasoning of the two hypotheses. The one that better accounts for the phenomenon is the one to be preferred. So charge of anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is a number of different connotations, but most generally refers to the act of attributing human traits to other animals. The charge of anthropomorphism is a charge that the attributor is making a category mistake. That is, say, human traits are conceptually distinct from animal traits, so to attribute the former to animals is conceptually wrong. Moreover, some argue that anthropomorphism is a human tendency that must be overcome in order to do good science, because it relies on unjustified generalization from linguistic humans to non-linguistic animals. These critics suggest that animals who lack language may not even have concepts, and without language, scientists are not in a position to attribute content. Since we are barred from making attribution, scientific psychology ought not engage with questions about animal mentality. And even if there is no categorical prohibition against attributing human properties to animals, some researchers may be too quick to conclude that an animal is using some higher order process in a particular instance. One concern is that researchers may have a failure of imagination when it comes to hypothesis generation. So the false dichotomy, either animals are stimulus response machines or they're agents with beliefs and desires. Since animals are not stimulus response machines, they must be a physiological agent. The problem with this argument is that not all machines implement stimulus response functions. Some machines are complex and indeterministic, and if animals were machines, they would be machines of that sort. So cultural influence, the concerns about anthropomorphism appears to be largely limited to Western scientists. It has been argued that researchers from countries with a Buddhist rather than Christian orientation are not culturally encouraged to see a categorical distinction between humans and non-human animals. Unlike Christianity, the Buddhist doctrine does not claim that humans, but not animals, have immortal souls, and that it does not allow humans to use animals for their own purposes in the way Christianity does. So do animals have rationality? Rationality is sometimes understood in the terms of acting for reason. Giving this starting point, Glock argues that animals are rational because they act in light of reason understood objectively in an agent-neutral fashion, and that the animal is sensitive to these reasons. However, discussions of animal rationality are confounded by the lack of consensus of what is required for rationality. So evolutionary psychology, some philosophical theories of rationality are based on initial acceptance of rationality across species, given evolutionary considerations. For example, on Fred Dretke's view, even some simple learned behaviors, such as birds avoiding eating a monarch butterfly, can be construed to minimal rational because monarchs who eat toxic milkweed become toxic to birds and other predators. When a bird learns not to eat a monarch butterfly after having formed an association between eating monarchs and vomiting, it has reason for its avoidance behavior. The birds also have a reason to avoid eating a viceroy, given that it is visually almost indistinguishable from a monarch, though not poisonous. The behavior in both cases is explained by the content of the bird's thought. And for Dretke, this is sufficient for a bird to count as a minimally rational agent. So rationality and tool use. Tool use in the wild has been discovered in a number of in different categories, including all great apes, some monkeys, some birds, sea otters, catechins. Reports of animal tool use offer evidence in favor of the claim that some animal behavior is functionally rational in the sense that its behavior allows the animal to achieve a goal. Furthermore, it is perhaps the result of evolutionary adaptation. However, the extent to which such evidence addresses the question of whether the specific behavior is rational in the sense of being in the space of reasons is a matter of debate. So do animals have belief? The question of whether animals have beliefs is also difficult to answer given the lack of theoretical agreement about the nature of belief. The most common view is that belief is a representational state and that the mental representations which fix content express propositional content. So some representations have suggested that animals might have representational belief that cannot be expressed propositionally. For example, Camp suggests that some beliefs are based on imaginistic representational systems, such as diagrams or maps, and that such systems can account for baboon social knowledge, so there is no need to posit a baboon language of thought. Will Cheney and Seyfarth claim that the baboon cognitive system is a vehicle by a language of thought given its nature and representational, discrete value, hierarchical, structured, rule-governed, open-ended, and independent of sensory modality. Camp argues that the inference is not warranted since non-sentential representational systems can also have such features. So Camp, who defends the claim that maps have a rich syntactic structure, admits one limitation: mental maps do not seem to be able to accommodate some first-order thoughts, such as nonspecific existentially quantified propositions or universally quantified propositions, or any second-order thoughts. Carruthers also argues that while even insects have beliefs, there is no evidence that any non-human species have metacognitive abilities. We suggest that the evidence from animal behavior supports the position that belief, like desire, comes in degrees. So in order for something to have a belief, it must have a concept. In order to have a concept, one must have a particular kind of knowledge, including knowledge of how the concept relates to other concepts. Non-human animals don't have such knowledge. Therefore, non-human animals don't have beliefs. What about concepts? One of the earliest methods of examining animal concepts came out of the series of experiments with pigeons. The subjects were shown photographs and were trained to peck at the pictures that contained a target object, such as a tree, and not respond to the pictures that did not contain the target object. After the training period, the pigeons were able to generalize to new photographs, pecking at only those that contained trees, just as in the training set. It was suggested that this sort of ability demonstrates the pigeon has a concept of the target object. And, Allen presents the general strategy for attributing concepts to animals as follows. An organism O may reasonably be attributed a concept X whenever O systematically discriminates some X's from some non-X's, and O is capable of detecting some of its own discrimination errors between X's and non-X's, and O is capable of learning to better discriminate X's from non-X's as a consequence of its capacity. Okay, nice overview there of animal cognition. Okay, hello Claire, Esoteric, Prince, Johnny, glad you're here. Keep moving. Okay, principle of learning and behavior. So, quick overview. Elicited behavior, habituation, and sensitization, classical conditioning, instrumental conditioning, schedules of reinforcement and choice behavior, stimulus-controlled behavior, extinction of conditioned behavior, adverse control, animal cognition. So psychology of learning. Studies of learning provide important insight into ways which long-lasting changes in behavior occur as a result of particular types of experience. New experiences, information stored as memory can be retrieved for later use. The learning is a biological process. Nervous system mechanisms such as neurons, transmitter circuits allows animals to adapt to their environment. Animals must learn; they cannot survive without it. Learning does not just occur in the classroom. It doesn't require explicit training or conscious processing. So, for example, 6 strategies for effective learning: elaboration, retrieval practice, space practice, dual coding, interleaving, and concrete examples. So Aristotle, remembering spontaneous recollection of something that had been previously experienced, recall, actual mental search for information, laws of association related to recall. Association began as a theory about how ideas combine in the mind. One thought leads to another, a free association. Law of contiguity. When we think of something, we also tend to think of things experienced along with it. Law of similarity. When we think of something, we also tend to think of things similar to it. Law of contrast. When we think of something, we tend to think of opposites. And the law of frequency. The more often things are associated together, the stronger their association. So Rene Descartes, human behavior is not controlled exclusively by conscious intent, free will, but that many human actions are reactions to external stimuli. So we had Cartesian dualism, 2 classes of human behavior: involuntary behavior, automatic reaction to external stimuli through special mechanisms called the reflex. Stimuli in the environment cause involuntary behavior. These stimuli produce behavior through a neural circuit that involves the brain, sense organs to the brain and brain muscles, rapid reactions to external stimuli. Descartes assumed that animals only have involuntary behavior, reflexes, sensory input reflected in response output. So voluntary behavior is conscious intent to act, free will. So Descartes sparked two traditions from the foundation of modern learning theory: mentalism, study of context and inner workings of the mind, and reflexology, study of reflex. Descartes believed that some of the content of the mind came from sensory experience. He also believed that some ideas were innate and existed in all of us regardless of experience. Nativism. Nativism is the view that certain skills or abilities are native or hardwired in the brain at birth. We are born with certain cognitive models, specialized genetically inherited physiological abilities that allow us to learn and acquire certain skills, like language. This is the nice diagram of Cartesian dualism. Events in the physical world are detected by sense organs. From here, the information is transmitted to the brain. The brain is connected to the mind by way of the pineal gland. Involuntary action is produced by a reflex arc that involves messages sent first to the sense organs to the brain, and then from the brain to the muscles. Voluntary action is initiated by the mind with messages sent to the brain and then the muscles. Thomas Hobbes accepted Descartes' distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior, and that behavior is controlled by the mind. Contrary to Descartes, Hobbes believed that mind does operate in an orderly, predictable, and lawful manner. Hobbes believed that the fundamental principle guiding conscious behavior was the principle of hedonism. People do things in pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, the positive and negative consequences of behavior. So John Locke took exception to nativism, tabula rasa. The brain has little innate ability, and almost everything is learned through interaction with the environment. Empiricism, the philosophical doctrine that all human knowledge comes at first from senses and experience. Empiricism denies that humans have innate ideas or anything knowable prior to existence. The David Hume, association of ideas, law of resemblance. Our thoughts run naturally from one idea to similar ideas, the law of contiguity. When we think of an object, there is a tendency to think that other things that were experienced at the same time or place. Law of cause and effects. When we think of an outcome, we come to think of the events that preceded them as causes. Thomas Brown, empiricist. Variables affecting associations, intensity of sensation, frequency of sensation, recency of sensation, number of associations which are already involved, similarity of past associations to current association. Hermann Ebbinghaus studied how associations are formed from lists of nonsense syllables and three-letter combinations, ability to recall under different experimental conditions. Strength of association is influenced by increased training, how close together or far apart the items are on the list. Then reflexes. Descartes first described the concept of reflex. Charles Bell and Francis Magendie, the early 1800s. Separate nerves are involved in the transmission of information from the brain to muscles and sensory receptors of the brain. You have Shekhinov and Pavlov. Not always a direct relationship between stimuli and responses. Responses release and inhibition do not depend on the intensity of the response, so a faint stimulus can result in a large response. Postulated that actions and thoughts were reflexive and can be elicited by imperceptible stimuli, could not account for variation in behavior because stimuli do not always elicit the same response. Helped explain a greater range of behaviors as reflexes. So the modern era, comparative cognition and evolution of intelligence. Darwin expands on Descartes. Humans and non-human animals may be more similar than once thought. Theory: humans descended from other animals. Evolution of mental brain circuits as well as physical traits. Basis for comparative psychology. Research with rats to understand basic psychology of mammals, including humans, and lead to neurophysiological investigations. Then George Romain's book on animal intelligence, 1884. Intelligence is the ability to learn. Functional neurology. Role of nervous system regulation of behavior and modification of behavior. In Ivan Pavlov's nervous system, all physiological function are controlled by the nervous system. Study the physiology of digestive reflexes. Later applied this concept to the formation of simple associations. So the modern era, 1939, animal modes of human behavior. Dollard and Miller. Research with non-human animals may provide information that may help understand human behavior. For example, the similarities in the avoidance of toxic food makes rats a model for human food aversion. Simpler, better controlled, and less expensive. Validity depends on similarity. Relevant features or relevant functions for problems studied. Skinner, 1953, expanded on Dollard and Miller to produce a formal system of behavioral testing, similar to medical studies, in that some research is less controversial with non-human animals. Animal models allow us to study areas of inquiry that are difficult or impossible to study with humans. Inference from animals as models for humans are problematic and controversial. If they are not justified, need to have good rationale. Do not make assumptions that non-human animals, rats, pigeons, primates, mice, are the same as humans, should be considered models that are not exactly like human behavior. To be valid, an animal model must be comparable or similar to humans in the domain being studied. Relevant features, structure, form of appearance, relevant function, action of group of activities to achieve a specific purpose. So nature versus nurture. What is nature? Instinct from the inherent disposition of a living organism towards a particular behavior. Innate and adjacent, meaning inborn, possessed at birth, inherent. Fixed action pattern is an innate stereotype behavior. Predisposition is a genetic effect which influences the phenotype of an organism, but which can be modified by the environmental conditions. So nurture is historically referred mainly to the care given to children by their parents, although any environmental experience also would count as nurture. In the blank state, tabula rasa is the notion that individual human beings are born blank with no built-in mental content and that their identity is defined entirely by events after birth. So how to think about nature and nurture is important. Public policy regarding education, health, and legal system. The doctrine of the blank state. Man has no nature. What he has is history. Apparently solves the problem of differences among races, sexes, and classes. Held out the hope of unlimited social progress. Equality does not happen because people are innately the same. Neuroscience research on the brain, genetics research on evolution theory has made the doctrine of the blank state untenable. However, learning and culture are also important influences. There are complex innate mechanisms for learning and culture. For example, infants have automatic understanding of objects, intentions, numbers, faces, tools, and language. So interaction of nature and nurture, so to say, genes and experience, relationship of experience and genes. Experiences are information processed by circuits in the brain. Some of the information is stored in the brain circuits as memory. Neurons in those circuits are changed biochemically and structurally. Genes are activated when neurons process information. The relationships of gene is behavior. Gene is considered to be the region of DNA. Some determine the structure of protein. Others regulate the production of proteins. Genes do not generally determine behavior. Genes code for proteins, which make up the structure of biochemistry of neurons. Neurons are organized into circuits. Circuits are part of systems, sensory, motor, emotional, motivational. Circuits possess information, store information, and produce net behavior or cognition. So concerns about the interaction of genes and environment. Most research still thinks in simplistic terms about the interaction. A mix of the two. An instinct versus learning, also a false dichotomy because instinct is the equivalent of nature. Learning is the equivalent of experience. By definition, instincts are inborn, therefore they do not require experience. However, they can be modified by experience. Learning by definition is dependent on experience. However, learning cannot occur without circuits in the brain. Basic brain circuit anatomy is determined by genes. Therefore, how you learn is determined by your genes, like classical condition, opera conditioning, and role modeling. Okay. Yep. Okay. Good stuff here. Just understand how we operate. So let's look at one more, animal consciousness. So consciousness, difficult to define, hard to measure. Reasonable answers include awareness of one's existence, sensations, thoughts surrounding, full activity of the mind and senses as in waking life. So it could be defined as wakefulness, voluntary action, awareness, or also theory of mind, awareness of others' thoughts and actions, awareness of surroundings, self-awareness, conscious morality, intentionality. So Edward Thorndike, the Catman, American physiologist, worked on animal learning behavior. His work led to the theory of connectionism. Most important contribution was the work on cats, learning to escape from puzzle boxes, which led him to create the law of effect. This states in regards to responses to stimuli that produce a satisfactory or pleasant state of affairs in a particular situation, that they are more likely to occur again in the situation if repeated, and conversely for discomfort. So theory of mind, animals can't speak no matter how much We make them look human because they're not human. Animals use communication that appears to seek influence over the behavior of others, but not their thoughts. Humans, however, know that others are different and that others have minds similar to their own whose knowledge can be altered by words or actions. Animal brains are wired for adaptations and accomplishments that put us to shame. We use mental power to accomplish things. So awareness of environment, like the spider sense. Awareness of environment is basically navigating in this so-called world so we don't bump into things. So Merker suggests that this arose as a solution to the logistic problem of the complexity of nervous systems, primarily as an interface between the spatial and the motor. Different parts of the brain control for different things. The visual and auditory cortexes deal with our body in a world map. The hypothalamus controls motivation and drive. The nigral system deals with priorities. The zonal incerta has a self to resolve conflicts. So self-awareness is in domesticated animals and other vertebrates depends on the degree of external self-perception possible on social organization or social communication through emotional signaling and on acquisition of symbolic language systems. We know we are conscious because of our introspection, and in others through communication of their introspection, though this is hardly objective. So studies of self are difficult, cannot claim human issues are the only way to be conscious. Language and self-consciousness is debatable. Not all behavior patterns have direct fitness consequences. So Dawkins suggests self-awareness evolved to help us make ourselves the objects of our thought, swinging through branches that allowed us to do it. Size is important for interacting with environment. Not all animals demonstrate being self-conscious. So intelligence. An animal's thinking when its behavior is complex, problem-solving, abstract generalization, and proves adaptable to changing circumstances. We have a tendency to anthropomorphize animals, give them human traits, think of animal actions in terms of our own conscious intentions, thoughts, and motives. We use language to penetrate their interior lives and fellow men. Just because one animal is smarter does not mean that we are more adaptive or more evolved or better. There is no great chain of being. We are all evolved from the same thing. Disobedient animals are every bit as clever as the ones that aren't. As quickly as the smart ones learn obedience, the dumb ones learn evasion. So apes have hands that allow them to deal with problems fish cannot. Animals can deceive each other and humans, but no self-deception. Asking what an animal is trying to do is a way to creatively probe the adaptive evolutionary purpose for its behavior. So consciousness and morality, the thing that animals have a kind of morality. They're moral enough not to attack each other for no reason, although it does benefit them. Altruism. Human morality remains rooted in moral sentiments we share with many other animals. Rational morality enhances rather than transcends biology, and non-reflective, generous, caring behavior remains the vital center of animal moral life. So animals feel. Emotions are subjective experiences, what people refer to when they say they feel something. Can't expect an animal to be trained well unless you understand it. Chimps can discern intentionality. One study showed a man either willful, not giving food, and not knowing about the food. The chimps could see it and remember for later. Some animals do things that seem intentional, like deception. Carnivores back off when a tougher carnivore shows up. A chimp with a rock, he carries the rock to another chimp and begins an intended intimidation display. One thing to question the chimp's idea of distinguishing truth and deception, simpler to say he intends to deceive. So animals have a sense of consciousness in terms of awareness. Even invertebrates like octopi and squid have their brains spread out through their body. What about animal language? So in conclusion, animals are conscious slightly. Animals do not have a theory mind. Animals are aware, not necessarily self-aware. Animals are intelligent in their own way. that help them and their ancestors survive to breed. Animals have a kind of morality. They utilize reciprocal altruism. Some animals feel emotion. Not much research on animals recognizing intentionality. None at all on animals displaying it. Okay, let's keep it going. So one last one on animal behavior and cognition. Early comparative psychology began right after Darwin's Origin of Species appeared in print because Darwin said that late arriving species displayed characteristics of earlier species. The same process shaped intelligence, and that suggested that carrying the cognitive behavior and features of earlier arriving animal could reveal things about another late arriving animal's cognition. As Darwin put it, it is highly probable that with mankind, the intellectual facilities have been mainly and gradually preferred through natural selection. Undoubtedly, it would be interesting to trace the development of each separate facility, intellectual skill from the state in which it exists in lower animals to which it exists in man. So George Romain's early student comparing mental abilities of many different kinds of animals employed effective inference, the assumption that there will be similarity between animal minds and human minds. So Romain's research tool, antidotes, not so great science. Antidotes tend to be infected with personal ideas and not reputably dated usually and cannot be tested directly. Also, anthropomorphization, animal mental behaviors and abilities. However, antidotes are a good source of information about animal behavior that can later on be studied more scientifically. The phylogenetic scale is the idea that animal intelligence can be organized in the way that medieval philosophers thought all living things could be organized by level of perfection, from least perfect to most perfect. This idea was abandoned because there are different kinds of intelligence, so can't put the smarts of a single animal in a particular spot in the scale. Each animal will have several kinds of intelligence, and these will fall in different relations to some kind in other animals. So Lloyd Morgan's canon, late 19th century psychologist, rejected effective inference as anthropomorphic and untestable, and recommended only studying observable behaviors in animals and only drawing those inferences from such behaviors that can be tested through experimentation. So Morgan's canon only interpreted an action as the product of a higher physical faculty if it cannot be interpreted as the product of a lower physical faculty or process. And despite his canon, even Morgan made assumptions about animal mental functions that were unwarranted by the evidence. He thought any form of learning indicates consciousness in the animal that displays it. So searching for the laws of learning, the discoveries of classical and operant condition came from research for searching for laws of learning. To early comparative psychologists, learning meant laws of association, such as reinforcement and trial and error. Those were general principles, so it was assumed they applied generally to all acts of learning, regardless of contents. We now know content matters. Species specialize in associating different sorts of things. Squirrels are great at memorizing the location of acorns, but they're not extraordinary memorists when it comes to other materials. In general, animals excel at specific types of learning that help their ancestors survive and reproduce. Seems obvious now, but this was not how behavior psychologists thought till about 1960, and it came as a surprise when they finally discovered it. So learning is mechanical expressions of trial and error, operant condition. So Edward Thorndike discovered that animals could learn how to escape from a puzzle box by trial and error. Cats and monkeys would stumble upon the way to escape the box, and after the initial discovery would gradually become better and better at escaping, indicating that behavior that preceded the escape was being reinforced, all by random process of physical exploration that produced what looked like trial and error. So learning to learn, Harry Harlow's insight learning to learn, which Harlow also called learning set, meant picking out a pattern from a series of learning experiences. Then a creature might learn even faster when faced with a similar learning situation in the future, like the monkeys in the door experiment. Confirming this, different species show this capacity to different degrees. Rat psychology, if all animals learn similar ways, why not study easily kept species that are easy to study, like rats? The best rat for these experiences, the Norway rat, because they're smart, clean, and easy to breed in captivity. Biggest problem with rat psychology, turns out what rats can learn and how they learn does not transfer to explanations for human learning and mechanisms thereof. So classical ethology, comparative psychology transforms by joining forces with ethology. Originally a European science interested in animal behavior, which developed out of zoology, not psychology. Ethology and comparative psychology were different in the mid-20th century. So comparative psychologists were American, emphasized learning, working in labs, very few species, cool scientific attitude, lab coats. Ethologists were European, emphasized instinct, worked in the labs and in the field. They observed many species. They loved the animals, and more informal. So originally, two camps fought like cats and dogs, but this eventually led to important improvements on both grounds of scientists. Behaviorists learned to recognize examples of learning prepared by evolution. Ethologists adopted more sympathetic observational procedures. So you had Timbergen and Lawrence, European ethologists. Timbergen and Lawrence invented much of the vocabulary still used today in the field of animal behavior. Timbergen studied sticklebacks, a freshwater fish. Timbergen performed high-quality research simply by observing the stickleback's behavior in great detail and experimenting to see what changed their behavior. For example, observed that the sticklebacks perform an elaborate mating ritual carried out the same way each time. First, the male stakes out a little area of sand at the bottom of the ditch or pond or aquarium. This becomes his territory, defended against all other males. The male stickleback then digs a little hole, shoveling sand with his snout until the hole is about 2 inches deep and 2 inches wide. He gathers stringy pieces of algae, coats them with a sticky substance created from his kidney, and piles the algae in the pit, performing a little mound. Finally, the male stickleback wiggles through the mound, leaving a tunnel. Now the stickleback changes color. He becomes bluish-white on the back and bright red on the underside. When she swims out, the male swims into the nest and fertilizes the eggs. He repeats the ritual with several females. As his mating urge wears off, the male's colors gradually fade. He takes up a sentry position near the nest, fanning the eggs with his fin in order to keep them supplied with oxygen. As the eggs mature, they need more oxygen, and the male spends more time fanning them. Finally, the babes hatch, and the male rounds up the strays by catching them in his mouth and carrying them back to the area of the nest. When the babies are large enough, they wander off. So typical of the products of ethological research, detailed, exact, and thorough records of complex animal behavior. The observation in the wild, ethological studies starts with an ethiogram. An ethiogram is a simple descriptive list of behaviors compiled by an observer in the natural environment. After observing animals in the natural environment, ethologists might develop hypotheses to be tested with simple experiments. These could be done outdoors in a laboratory environment. Advances in camera technology and deep GPS technology revolutionized the study of animals in the wild toward the end of the 20th century. Creative cameras, small cameras, wireless transmitters could be attached to anything from a mouse to a whale, giving researchers a video record of the creature's travel. Fiber optics allow filming inside tiny burrows, tunnels, and nests. Global position systems permit precise tracking of individual animals. So action patterns, motor programs. Action patterns in motor programs are behaviors sometimes called instinctive or innate. They are shaped by the animal's genetic heritage, wired into the brain nervous system. In many cases, these behaviors can be elicited by direct brain stimulation. Releasers, special typical behaviors are often triggered by specific stimuli in the environment. The stimulus that triggers an action pattern is called the sign stimulus or releaser. So Conrad Lorenz studied the gray-lag goose. Example above is found in so many animal behavior textbooks it might be called the Pavlov's dog of ethology. This is the gray-lag goose retrieving her egg. Lawrence and Timberger use it as a paradigmatic example of instinctive behavior set off by a specific stimulus, sight of the egg outside the nest. Lawrence discovered that the goose would perform the entire retrieval motion even if he removed the egg in the middle of the sequence of actions. This led to Lawrence to formulate the concept of endogenous, coming from within, running out. Imprinting, when Conrad Lawrence lived on a farm with the gray-leg geese, he noticed that young goslings followed the first thing they saw after hatching. Lawrence called this phenomenon imprinting. Ducklings would also imprint on the first thing that moves. When they hatch, whether it's an animate or inanimate, imprinting is found mostly in ground-dwelling birds as the prey species such as goats and lambs. It keeps the young in close proximity to a protective parent. Babyishness. Lawrence noticed that baby animals of many species have the same look. For one thing, they have large heads in proportion to their body. They have large round eyes, protruding foreheads, soft jawlines, and plump cheeks. Often they are fuzzy. They have stubby legs. Lawrence labeled this pattern of feature as babyishness. Cross-species adaptation. The tendency of adult animals to be nurturing towards babyish-looking animals might help explain why animals sometimes adopt young of different species. Cross-species adoption. So vacuum displacement and redirect activities. Action patterns can appear without assigned stimulus. Vacuum activity is the name Lawrence gave to the behavior set off for no apparent reason. In a vacuum, Lawrence suggested that animals have a need to exercise biologically built-in behaviors, even if the behavior has no function. Displacement activities, as described by Lawrence, are motor programs that seem to discharge tension or anxiety. If one is offering a nut to a wide squirrel, the squirrel becomes conflicted, caught between two incompatible drives. It wants the nut but fears the human. Caught between approach and avoidance tendency, the squirrel becomes visibly nervous. It may take a few hops towards the human holding the nut, then scratch itself suddenly or make a few digging movements. This does not mean the squirrel itches or needs to dig a hole. So redirected activity is the third example of action pattern arousal in unusual circumstance. Lawrence defined a redirected activity as a behavior that moved from a threatening or inaccessible target to another target that is more convenient or less threatening. The decline of old assumptions. Mid-20th century comparative psychologists all thought that learning involved stimulus-response conditioning that produced an association. They all assumed that any association was equally possible. Later in the century, it became clear that it was not true. Associations are both more likely and acquired more quickly when the stimulus is involved in something that the creature's evolutionary past and biological characteristics made more relevant to the creature's behavior repertoire. These traits that promote the survival of creatures and hence have an evolutionary basis that sensitizes them to these particular stimuli. So phobias is prepared learning. Thorndike was one of the very few researchers to recognize that some forms of learning were natural and others were not. Thorndike pointed out that trial and error learning occurred fastest when animals were motivated, prepared to learn, paying attention to the relevant cues. Thorndike called these secondary laws of learning. Seligman reviewed Thorndike's preparedness concept to explain some strange things about phobias. Powerful rational fears. Seligman asked, why are some phobias so much more common and difficult to treat than others? The most common phobias involve spiders, snakes, small animals such as rats. Other phobias can sometimes be treated with mild forms of therapy like bibliotherapy, reading, but these three types were resistant to treatment. Seligman suggested that certain common phobias must be biologically prepared by evolution. Fear of snakes, spiders, rodents, heights, water, enclosed spaces have one thing in common: they could save a person's life. If so, they preserve the DNA that encourages such a fear response. So social ethology, social behavior in animals. By the 1960s, ethologists got interested in studying animals as they interact with each other. The new ethologists focused on several ways that animals can interact: competition, utmost universal competition among males, social species, communication, displays between animals, the use of chemicals to organize and maintain ant communities, cooperation, symbiotic relationships between cleaner fish and larger fish, or cooperation in hunting and lions. Social ethology includes predator-prey interactions, displays such as alarm responses, and competitions for status and territory. All have implications for reproduction, so instinctive tendencies in these areas are strong. Ethologists study friendly or pro-social behavior, invitation, displays, grooming, play. They study the reproductive cycle, courting, mating, and raising offspring. We have alarm responses. Probably the best way to avoid being eaten by a predator is to avoid it. Vervet monkeys give at least 3 distinct alarm calls for 3 different predators: leopards, eagles, and snakes. The alarm signals lead to distinct behavioral responses. Seafarth and colleagues played tape recordings of alarm calls to groups of free-ranging, non-captive vervets. The leopard-type alarm call made the monkeys run into trees. The eagle-type alarm call made them look up in the sky. The snake-type alarm call made them look down to the ground. So struggles for territory and social status. Group living animals commonly joust for dominance. Different animals test each other to see who is really boss. The outcome has important implication for each animal's genetic success. Dominant animals usually reproduce more than non-dominant animals. So thought, fear, and intentional movements. One of the most common threat displays is the stare. Animals as diverse as crabs, lizards, and birds all perceive staring as a threat. This is one reason people are advised never to stare at potentially hostile dogs or bears. A common threat display for the dog is a low growl with ears laid back and teeth bared. Cats have a threat displayed also. They stare, make a low growling sound, and adopt a posture that indicates they may attack. If seriously threatened, cats hiss, arch their backs, and fluff their fur in the classic cat fight posture. Such a display might be considered a fear display as much as a threat display. Fear and threat displays are often similar. Okay, so that's my nice review of animal consciousness. A lot of information there, related to consciousness in general, trying to understand what it is that animals do. And so now let's look at some learning. So from the Air Force Research Lab on process logic, dynamic logic. So the mind, cognitive algorithms. The mind, basic mechanisms, concepts, models of objects, their relations and situation, instincts, internal sensors, like blood sugar levels, emotions, neural signals connecting instincts and concepts, behavior, models of goals, muscle movement, learning and thinking, hierarchy, dual hierarchy of language and cognition. It's artificial intelligence, and all attempts to model mind for over 60 years are failing. Perception cognition required, evaluating large number of combinations, complexity of combinations, general problem for the century, combination of 100 elements or 100 to 100, more than the universe, related to Gödelian limitations of logic. So you have dynamic logic, a process logic from vague to crisp, without combination, matches memories to signal from eyes, closed eyes experiment, overcomes complexity of combinations through fast algorithms. So dynamic logic is equivalent to the knowledge instinct. So look at the hierarchy of cognition from sensory motor signals, objects, situation, abstract ideas, cognitions, top representations, purpose, unify entire life experience. Knowledge instinct. Emotions are felt as beautiful. We understand, feel, meaning of life. Conceptual and emotional content are not differentiated. In situations, vague and unconscious representation. Unified lower level representation. Knowledge, instinct, emotions are conscious. For objects, vague and less conscious representation. Knowledge, instincts, emotions could be conscious. And sensory motor signals. Concrete conscious mental perceptions, memories, knowledge, intentions, emotions are below consciousness. So, connection of beauty, conceptual map of cognition, language, and surrounding. So connecting language and cognition requires motivation. In other words, emotions. If language emotionally is too weak, meanings are lost. Cultures disintegrate. If language emotionality is too strong, nothing could be changed. Cultures stagnate. Hence the value of music. So language splits knowledge into many conceptual pieces. Human face emotional choices, contradictions, cognitive dissonances. The mind needs emotion to unify language and cognition, to cope with contradictions in knowledge. Animal vocalizations, unified emotions and concept. So human vocalization split between language and concept, music and concept, music and emotions. Is music similar to animal language? Musical emotions turn diverse knowledge into unified self, needed for cultural evolution. A lot of studies into this and awards for it, publications, future directions of research and predictions. So yeah, the knowledge instinct, two mechanisms, differentiation and synthesis. Differentiation at entry level of the hierarchy, more detailed concepts, separates concepts from emotions. Synthesis connects concepts and emotions. Knowledge and life connects language and cognition. Create the hierarchies, concepts acquire meaning at the next level. Evolutionary dynamics, complex interaction of opposing mechanisms. So more charts trying to understand this connection. Emotion languages, animals, undifferentiated concepts, emotion behaviors, vocalizations. Vocal tract is controlled from ancient emotional limbic system. Human language evolution, language evolved towards semantics and less emotion. Still emotions are needed, otherwise no synthesis, no meaning. Two emotional centers, limbic, involuntary, and cortex conscious, emotionality and voice, sound, melody of speech. Emotional differences among languages, all language evolved towards less emotionality, more semantic flexibility, but potential to lose meaning. Too fast evolution, lose meaning. Too slow evolution, cultural stagnates. Speed is determined by grammar, inflections, called Humboldt's firmness. So Aristotle and Gödel. Aristotle, logic, the supreme way of argument. Forms, representation in the mind. Forms as potentiality evolves into form as actuality. Potentialities are not logical. Logical actualities. Language and thinking are closely linked. And then Boole to Russell, formalization of logic. Logicians eliminate from logic uncertainty of language. Hilbert formalizes rules of mathematical proofs forever. And Gödel, logic is not consistent. Any statement can be proved true and false. So language, emotions, and cultures. Conceptual content of cultures, words, phrases easily borrowed among cultures. Emotional content of cultures, in voice, sound, melody, or speech determined by grammar, cannot be borrowed among culture. English languages, differential is greater than synthesis. Weak connection between conceptual and emotional since the 15th century. Pragmatic high culture, but may lead to crisis, lost in meaning. Arabic languages, synthesis is greater than differentiation. Strong connection between conceptual and emotional, cultural immobility, but strong feel of identity and purpose. Even been tested on this. Okay, so just interesting areas of research, rounding up things I wanted to get to. And here's the last one I got on thinking and intelligence. So, thought distinguish between the various elements of cognition, such as concepts, prototypes, propositions, schemas, and mental images. Distinguish between the varieties of conscious thought, such as subconscious thinking, non-conscious thinking, and implicit learning. Contrast algorithms and heuristic as problem-solving strategies, and give an example of each. Discuss the various types of reasoning, such as formal reasoning, informal reasoning, dialectical reasoning, and stages of reflective judgment, and note the defining characters of each. So the elements of cognition. A concept is a mental category that groups objects, relations, activities, abstractions, or qualities that share certain properties. Concepts simplify and summarize information about the world so that it is manageable and so that we can make decisions quickly and efficiently. Basic concepts have a moderate number of instances. They're easier to acquire than concepts with few or many instances. Children seem to learn basic level concepts earlier than other concepts. Adults use basic concepts more often than other concepts because basic concepts convey an optimal amount of information in most situations. Qualities associated with a concept do not necessarily all apply to every instance. Some apples are not red, some dogs do not bark, some birds do not fly, but all the instances of a concept do share a family resemblance. Prototypical instances of a concept are more representative than others. The words we use to express concepts may influence or shape how we think about them. Warp's theory, propositions are made up of concepts and express a unitary idea. They may be linked together to form cognitive schemas. Cognitive schemas serve as a mental framework for thinking about aspects of the world. Mental images can play a role in thinking. They're also important in constructing cognitive schemas. Visual images behave much like images on a computer screen. We can manipulate them, occur in mental space of fixed size. Smaller ones contain less detail than larger ones. So how consciousness is thought. Not all mental processes are conscious. Subconscious processes lie outside of awareness, but can be brought into consciousness when necessary. They allow us to perform two more actions at once, while one action is highly automatic. Multitasking, toggling between tasks that are not automatic, usually inefficient, introduces error, and can even be dangerous. We do not have unlimited cognitive capacity to take on more and more tasks simultaneously. Neuroscience processes remain outside of awareness, but nonetheless affect behavior. They are involved in implicit learning, which occurs when we learn something but don't know how we learned it and aren't able to state exactly what we've learned. Every conscious processing has been carried out in a mindless fashion if we overlook changes in context that call for change in behavior. So schema, concepts leading to propositions, leading to cognitive schemas, or mental images leading to cognitive schemas. So problem solving and decision making. When problems are well defined, they can often be solved by applying an algorithm. Algorithm's problem solving strategy guaranteed to produce correct or best solution even if the user does not know how it works. When problems are fuzzier, people often must apply rules of thumb called heuristics, which help limit options to a manageable number of promising ones and reduce the cognitive effect to make decisions. Some problems lend themselves to non-conscious processes such as intuition and insight. Fast thinking applies to rapid, intuitive, emotional, almost automatic decisions. Slow thinking requires intellectual effort, which is why most people rely on the former and make mistakes. Reasoning rationally. Reasoning is the purposeful mental activity that involves operating on information to reach a conclusion. Unlike impulsive, fast, or non-conscious responding, reasoning requires us to draw specific inferences from observation, facts, or assumptions. Formal reasoning problems provide the information necessary to reach a conclusion and solution and permit a single correct or best answer. Informal reasoning problems often have no clearly correct solution, thus they require dialectic thinking about opposing points of view. Studies of reflective judgment show that many people have trouble thinking dialectically. People make different assumptions about how things are known. They use different ways of justifying their beliefs. Pre-reflexive thinkers do not distinguish between knowledge and belief or belief and evidence. They tend to assume that a correct answer always exists, and it can be obtained directly through the senses or from authorities. Quasi-reflective thinkers recognize that some things cannot be known with absolute certainty. Judgment should be supported by reason, yet they pay attention only to evidence that fits what they already believe. They seem to think that because knowledge is uncertain, any judgment about the evidence is purely subjective. We all have a right to our own opinion. Those who think reflexively understand that some things cannot be known with certainty. However, they also assume that some judgments are more valid than others based on coherence, fit with available evidence, and usefulness. They're willing to consider evidence from a variety of sources and to reason dialectically. So reflective thinking. Okay, barriers to rationality. Describe how the effect heuristic and the availability heuristic both illustrate the tendency to exaggerate the improbable. Explain how the framing effect leads people to avoid loss in probabilistic judgments. Summarize the mechanism driving the fairness, biased, hindsight bias, confirmation bias, and mental sets, and give an example of each. Explain the process of cognitive dissonance, and describe 3 conditions under which feelings of cognitive dissonance are likely to occur. And discuss the conditions under which cognitive biases can be determined detrimental to reasoning and when they might be beneficial. So exaggerating the improbable, minimizing the probable. People tend to exaggerate the likeliness of improbable events in part because they affect an availability heuristic. Effective heuristic, the tendency to consult one's emotions instead of estimating probabilities objectively, and the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge the probability of a type of event by how easy it is to think of examples or instances. So being able to think easily of instances of an event, especially one with strong emotional component, sways us to believe that an event is particularly likely to happen. Catastrophes and shocking accidents stand out in our minds, becoming more available mentally than other kinds of negative events. They overestimate frequency of deaths of tornadoes, underestimate frequencies of deaths from asthma. So avoiding loss, people try to avoid or minimize the risk of incurring losses when they make decisions. We are swayed in our choices by the desire to avoid loss. The framing effect, how the choice is presented, the same information can be evaluated quite differently if it's presented in either a positive or negative light. The studies that show how things are worded. Biases in mental states. People often forego economic gain because of a fairness bias, motivated to see fairness prevail. Fairness bias appears to have evolutionary roots. It is being studied in primates, human toddlers, and using brain scams. There's reason for saying that hindsight is 20/20. People often overestimate their ability to have made accurate predictions. The hindsight bias shows up all the time in evaluating relationships, medical judgments, military opinions. When people are thinking about the issue they already feel strongly about, they often succumb to the confirmation bias, paying attention only to evidence that confirms their belief and finding fault with evidence that points in a different direction. Thinking critically, most of us apply a double standard. We think most critically about results we dislike. Another barrier to rational thinking is the development of a mental set, the tendency to try to solve new problems by using the same heuristic strategies and rules that worked in the past on similar problems. Mental sets are not helpful when a problem calls for fresh insights and methods. The need for cognitive consistency. Mental sets and the confirmation bias cause us to avoid evidence that contradicts our beliefs. When two cognitions or a cognition and a behavior conflict, it's known as the cognitive dissonance. We are motivated to reduce dissonance by rejecting or changing a belief, changing our behavior, rationalizing. Efforts to reduce dissonance occur under three conditions: after a decision has been made, post-decision dissonance, when people's actions violate their concept of the self as honest and kind, when they have put hard work into an activity, the justification of effort. So cognitive dissonance, you have tension, the cognitions conflict, behavior conflicts with attitude or belief. This tension, cognitive dissonance, efforts to reduce dissonance, reject belief, change behavior, deny the evidence, to rationalize. Well studied. Justification of effort. Overcoming our cognitive biases. Biases sound like bad things, but they can sometimes be beneficial by speeding our mental processes of a complex world or smoothing our societal interactions. But mental biases can also get us into trouble. The bias blind spot, we acknowledge that other people have biases that distort reality, but we tend to think that we are free of bias and see the world as it really is. Most people can reduce their irrationality in many situations, such as when a decision is particularly important or personally meaningful. After we understand a bias, we may be able to reduce or eliminate it. This can happen if we make an active, mindful effort to do so and take time to think carefully. So measuring intelligence, the psychometric approach, to outline the basic logic underlying factor analysis and describe its use in measuring intelligence, summarize the original notion of IQ and some problems associated with it, and discuss how intelligence tests evolved during the early 1900s. So measuring the invisible, intelligence is difficult to define. The psychometric approach focuses on how well people perform on standardized aptitude tests. Most psychometric psychologists believe that a general ability, a G factor, underlies this performance. They hold that the general ability can be further described as either crystallized, reflecting accumulated knowledge and skills, like doing arithmetic, defining words, making political decisions, or fluid, reflecting the ability to reason, to use information to solve new problems. So the IQ test, the invention, the intelligent quotient, or IQ, represents how well a person has done on an intelligence test compared to other people. Alfred Binet designed the first widely used intelligence test to identify children who could benefit from remedial work. In the United States, people assumed that intelligence tests revealed natural ability, and they used the test to categorize people. So IQ tests have been criticized for being biased in favor of white middle-class people, but efforts to construct tests that are free of cultural influence have been disappointing. Cultural affects nearly everything we do with taking a test, from attitude to problem-solving strategies. Stereotypes exist about a person's ethnicity, gender, age. These may cause the person to feel stereotype threat, which can lead to anxiety that interferes with test performance. In the case of negative stereotypes, or enhanced performance in the case of positive stereotypes. So, the bell curve type performance task on the Wechsler test. So object assembly, digital symbol, picture completion, the stereotype threat, negative stereotype about one's group, anxiety, disidentification, worsen performance, reduce motivation. So dissecting intelligence, the cognitive approach. Describe how metacognition, the triarchic theory of intelligence and theory of multiple intelligence and emotional intelligence shed light on the diversity of what intelligence means. Outline how longitudinal studies of cross-cultural studies shed light on the interplay of motivation, hard work, and intellectual achievement. Elements of intelligence. Cognitive approaches to intelligence emphasize several kinds of intelligence and the strategies people use to solve problems. Important cognitive ingredient of intelligence is metacognition, which involves the knowledge or awareness of your own cognitive processes and the ability to monitor and control those processes. So Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory proposes three aspects of intelligence: componential, analytic, experiential, creative, contextual, practical. So componential, analytic, the information processing strategies you draw on when thinking intelligently about a problem. Experiential, creativity and transferring skills to new situation. Contextual, practical applications of intelligence. Gardner's multiple intelligence theory holds that intelligence is best characterized as a capacity to process certain kinds of information. Rather than spotlighting a single G factor, Gardner claims that the information processing skills we possess can take many forms. Emotional intelligence is also important and involves the ability to identify your own and other people's emotions, accurately express emotions clearly, regulate emotions in yourself and others. Emotional intelligence can facilitate social interactions. Motivation, hard work, and intellectual success. Intellectual achievement can also depend on motivation, hard work, self-discipline. Cross-cultural work shows that differences in academic performance are strongly influenced by belief about the origins of mental abilities, parental standards, and attitudes towards education. Hard work shown to pay off. Animal minds. Summarize the evidence both supporting and refuting the concept of animal intelligence. Summarize the evidence both supporting and refuting the concept of animal language use. Explained by both anthropomorphism and anthropodential are unwise approaches to understanding animal cognition. So animal intelligence. Some researchers, especially those in cognitive ethology, argue that non-human animals have greater cognitive abilities than previously thought. Some animals can use objects as simple tools. Chimpanzees and birds have shown evidence of simple understanding of numbers. Certain animals may have aspects of theory of mind and understanding of how their own minds and the minds of others work, like great apes, dolphins, and elephants. Chimps and even monkeys may be capable of some metacognition, the ability to understand and monitor their own cognitive processes. The animals and language and projects using visual symbol systems or American Sign Language, primates have acquired linguistic skills, words as geometric plastic shapes, symbols on a keyboard monitored by computers. Animals in these situations learn to follow instructions, answer questions, make requests. They even seem to use their newfound skills to apologize for being disobedient, scold their trainers, talk to themselves. Some animals seem able to use simple grammatic ordering rules to convey or comprehend meaning, even non-primates such as dolphins and African gray parrots. So thinking about the thinking of animals, scientists are divided about how to interpret the findings of animal cognition. Some worry about anthropomorphism, falsely attributing human qualities to non-human beings. Others are more concerned about anthropodential, believing that human beings have nothing in common with other animals. Okay, so that was a quick overview of 7 studies. And now I'm going to do some reading from some articles. I got 3 articles left, some stuff on linguistics, and that's the end of the science presentations. It's been a long labor. It's going to be about 40 hours when I'm finished. And yeah, so I'm almost done with the science aspect, and then I'm going to move into the more esoteric stuff. So I have 3 articles I want to read. 2 of them I'll probably do today. So let's start with this one, Mechanisms of Social Cognition by Chris Frith. And, if you've seen him on some of the other studies, I want to get through the most recent knowledge, some articles that give a nice overview of the most recent knowledge. So, I read at length for hours these papers yesterday about the brain as a predictive machine. And so if you've been following, we've covered an overview of the latest scientific research on these subjects. So let's jump right in. I'm not sure how much of this I'm going to read. Some of those yesterday I think were extremely worthwhile, and I read basically the whole thing. It took me a long time. This one I might just read parts of. Okay. So Mechanisms of Social Cognition, 2010, from the Annual Review of Psychology. Frith from the University College of London. Husband-wife research pair. Social animals, including humans, share a range of social mechanisms that are automatic and implicit and enable learning by observation. Learning from others includes imitation of actions and mirroring of emotions. Learning about others, such as their group membership and reputation, is crucial for social interactions that depend on trust. For accurate prediction of others' changeable dispositions, mentalizing is required, tracking of intentions, desires, and belief. Implicit mentalizing is present in the infants less than 1 year old, as well as in some non-human species. Explicit mentalizing is a metacognitive process and enhances the ability to learn about the world through self-monitoring and reflection, and may be uniquely human. Metacognitive processes can also exert control over automatic behavior, for instance, when short-term gains oppose long-term aims, or when selfish and pro-social interests collide. We suggest that they also underlie the ability to explicitly share experiences with other agents, as in reflective discussion and teaching. They are key in increasing the accuracy of the models of the world that we construct. So, introduction. What is social about social cognition? Consider the red-footed tortoise. They're not social animals. They live lives of almost complete isolation apart from the brief interactions necessary for reproduction, and yet we can learn to perform a difficult detour task simply by observing an experience conspecific. Imagine a hive of bees. Bees are undeniably social animals. Their behavior is governed by rules that allow them to share knowledge and make group decisions. Gaining benefit by watching and interacting with conspecifics and even other species is widespread among animals, including humans. We will review work that shows that by following others and by observing their choices, it's possible to learn not only about places, but also about actions, objects, and other agents. This is very useful because by observing what happens to others, we can learn indirectly without experiencing the potential disastrous errors associated with direct learning. Like the tortoise, human beings can learn a lot from simply observing others when their behavior has no deliberate communicative intent, and when social information is being used just like any other publicly available information in the environment. But also, like bees, human beings cooperate and can make group decisions that are better than those made by single individuals. We'll also discuss cognitive processes that enable deliberate communication, teaching, and cooperation, but are outside the capacities of tortoises and bees. These are processes that enable individuals to understand one another with a high degree of precision. They are often referred to as mentalizing or having a theory of mind. A largely implicit form of mentalizing is likely to be involved in perspective taking and tracking the intentional states of others, and this has been claimed for a variety of social animals as well as humans. It is only the explicit form of mentalizing that appears to be unique to humans. We will point out that explicit mentalizing is closely linked to metacognition, the ability to reflect on one's action and to think about one's own thoughts. This ability, we will argue, confers significant benefits to human social cognition over and above the contribution from the many powerful implicit processes that we share with other social species. However, even these abilities have emerged as the result of a long evolutionary process. It's the importance of comparative studies. Neural mechanisms which have evolved to allow social interaction need to be studied systematically across species, and most of this work still remains to be done. In this essay, we will not go into details of such mechanisms when pertinent reviews already exist. This is the case in particular for general learning mechanisms, which are also fundamental to social learning. These involve conditioning, associative, and instrumental learning. This comparative approach to social cognition can identify processes in common across species. It can also help identifying the nature of those processes that are unique or at least dramatically more highly developed in humans. We passionately believe that all social cognitive neuroscience needs to break away from a restrictive phrenology that links circumcised brain regions to underspecified social processes. Although we build such links, we are committed to the idea that it's necessary to develop a mechanistic account of these processes. In this essay, we'll try to provide some pointers towards such accounts. The importance of implicit processes. One of the proudest achievements of human beings is the ability to reflect on themselves, their past, present, and future. This tends to obscure the fact that most of our cognition occurs automatically and without awareness. It comes as a surprise that even such sophisticated social processes as group decision and mentalizing can occur automatically and can happen without a deliberate attempt to achieve that decision, individually or collectively. Here we follow the tradition of cognitive psychologists who make a fundamental distinction between implicit, automatic, unconscious processes and processes which generate explicit conscious products. Many recent reviews of social cognition have emphasized the same distinction. Explicit processes can be recognized through their interference with currently ongoing activity. Implicit processes can be reorganized when people cannot report the stimulus that elicits their behavior or are unaware of the behavior that is elicited. However, many cognitive abilities that seem so evidently explicit actually work just as well without awareness. Furthermore, the study of explicit process in non-humans is extremely difficult, but we can certainly not assume that explicit knowledge is unique to humans. Learning through observing others, learning about places. Fish are among the many animals that learn about the location of food by observing the behavior of others. Here's an example. An individual isolated nine-spiked stickleback learns that food can be found on the left side of the tank and will therefore swim to the left side when given the choice. But after a delay of 7 days, if he can observe other fish feeding on the right side of the tank, he will swim to the right. This is presumably because the private information about food being on the left is too old and unreliable. Examples of social influence on foraging behavior can be observed in many animals, including humans. Related process is gaze, following through which we automatically look at the place towards which someone else is looking. This example of social influence has been demonstrated in ravens, goats, dogs, and primates. Gaze following is reliably used by human infants to learn about objects and events from the 1 year of age. In adult human gaze following seems to be automatic in the sense that people follow the gaze of another person, even when this behavior is counter to their intentions. 2006 study used a target detection task to show that individuals would follow the gaze of another person, even when the person persistently looked in the wrong direction. Intriguingly, while participants were unable to stop themselves in the gaze following and were unaware of the contingency, they did not register a socially relevant fact. They rated the person who looked in the wrong direction as less trustworthy. For learning about objects, animals need to distinguish between nice objects that should be approached and dangerous objects that should be avoided. Here again, learning commonly occurs through observation. For example, in experiments, series of experiments demonstrated that the rhesus monkey acquired fear of snakes very quickly by observing another monkey showing fear towards snakes. Fear conditioning through observation has also been demonstrated in humans, but learning about objects is not just restricted to fear condition. For example, objects looked at by other people are preferred more than objects that do not receive attention. Learning about actions. Many animals learn which actions to perform by observing others. For example, chimpanzees will imitate a demonstrated sequence of actions and gain access to food in a puzzle box. Wild mongoose pups learn by observing an adult to open the Kinder eggs by either smashing them to the ground or biting them. Both actions are equally effective at getting access to the food in the egg. However, the action chosen by the pups was determined by what they saw an adult do. Such imitative learning can be seen in human infants from the age of 1 year. By this age, infants will imitate both instrumental and arbitrary actions when they see an adult interacting with a novel object. For example, they quickly learn that they can press buttons on a remote control and phones to obtain interesting effects. Learning about agents. Animals need to be able to distinguish agents from objects. First of all, agents move of their own intention and have motion patterns that are different from moving physical objects, and specific brain structures in the temporal lobe are involved in detecting the difference. Thus, in humans, perception of biological motion is served by a circumscribed brain region in the superior temporal sulcus, and the ability to distinguish this motion from other kinds of motion is exquisitely tuned. Over and above detecting animacy, animals need the ability to detect agents who might be prey or predator. This is critical for survival even immediately after birth. One would therefore expect to see specially adapted neural mechanisms that require little, if any, learning. Indeed, newly hatched chickens exhibit a spontaneous preference for biological motion patterns, and this mechanism facilitates imprinting. Agents also typically have faces, and their eyes give cues to what they're interested in. A posterior region of the STS is specialized for analysis of facial movements, while invariant aspects of faces are analyzed in the fusiform gyrus. Another important cue to agency is contingent responding. Human infants and adults alike are likely to treat shapeless objects as being animate if the object moves or make noises that are contingent on their own actions. This is reminiscent of the eases with which we are tricked by a ventriloquist doll. Learning about other individuals and how to interact with them is vital for all social animals. This is most particularly relevant for mate choice. Naive female fruit flies will choose as partners male flies that have been seen mating with experienced females. Effects of observation on mate choice are also observed in guppies and quail. Well-disposed agents need to be distinguished from those who are not. Preverbal human infants, 6 to 10 months after observing agents interacting with each other, prefer those who help others to those who hinder others. Learning about the status of conspecifics is also important for knowing whom to approach and whom to avoid. Many animals can infer social rank by observation alone. For instance, fish learn whom not to pick a fight with through observation. So neural mechanisms of learning through observation, association learning. It seems plausible that learning through observation could be built from the basic mechanisms of associated learning. 1993 report that the model monkey's behavior on seeing a snake elicit fear in the observer monkey. For the observer monkey, the fear response of the model monkey acts as an unconditional stimulus through emotional contagion and elicits the fear response. Though classical conditioning of the snake becomes associated with the fear response in the observer monkey. Note, however, the classical conditioning has strict limitations forged by evolution. Thus, a potentially dangerous thing like a snake can trigger conditioning of the fear response in the infant monkey, but innocuous flower does not. Humans also show fear conditioning through observation, presumably via the same mechanisms. This can occur even when the conditioned stimulus is presented subliminally, which suggests that the learning depends on an implicit process. Indeed, we suspect that most, if not all, of the learning processes we have discussed so far are examples of implicit processes. So reward learning conditioned mechanisms can be applied to other kinds of social learning through observation. We know that places and objects acquire value through being associated with reward. We will go to the places and approach the objects with the highest value. A simple extension of this mechanism would entail the places and objects should gain value if they are approached by others and lose value if they are avoided by others. Evidence for such simple models comes from the finding that in many species, including fish and rodents, the probability that an observer will adopt a particular behavioral increases monotonically with the proportion of potential models exhibiting that behavior. Social learning seems to involve the same neural systems as non-social reward-based learning. 2011 showed that learning for social rewards involves the same neural system as learning for money, which values being represented in ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and reward predictions errors being represented in this stratium. Furthermore, the same reward learning system is activated when we see others choosing the objects we like, and neural signals in the system reflecting how much we value an object will increase when we know that other objects value this object. In gaze following, investigations of the neural basis of gaze following indicate something of the complexity of mechanisms involved when we imitate actions. At least 3 components are necessary. The observer must first recognize an agent and orient towards the face and eyes. This is probably mediated by a long-established subcortical route. The observer must then work out the target of the gaze from the position of the agent's eyes. It is not sufficient simply to imitate the eye movement, since the observer and the agent have different viewpoints. The lateral interparietal area, a brain region previously linked to attention and saccadic planning, is likely to have a role in this computation. Mirror neurons have been located here, which fire when a monkey looks in the preferred direction of the neuron, and also when observed monkeys look in this direction. In addition, the observer must believe that the gaze following is likely to lead to a valuable outcome. Here again, the lateral interparietal area neurons seem relevant since they signal the value of the social and non-social information, but only when this information is relevant to the decisions about orienting. Mirroring, the aspects of learning through observation that has been most extensively investigated at the neural level, relates to action. When we learn about actions from observing others, we are effectively learning to imitate them. Forms of copying are often referred to as imitation, mimicry, and emulation, each emphasizing different aspects of copying a model. The process underlying these forms of copying has recently been reinterpreted as a direct result of a specifically social neural mechanism associated with mirror neurons. The first study to identify such neurons in the ventral premotor cortex, F5, the rhesus monkey. While there's still some controversy about the role of this mechanism as a facilitator imitation, the discovery of mirror neurons has been a major impact on our understanding of the nature and the role of imitation. The tendency to imitate the actions of others is limited to be automatic. This is shown by the finding that high working memory load facilitates rather than hinders behavioral imitation. Nevertheless, imitations can be controlled in a top-down fashion, and we do not imitate the actions of everyone we observe. Perceiving an emotional response of another person elicits the same emotional response in itself. This is called the emotional contagion and allows us to share the emotion of the person we are observing. A prerequisite of empathy, emotional contagion supplies a basic conditioning mechanism through which we learn from others on the basis of their emotional expressions. This process, even though likely underwritten by a general mechanism of associated learning, has some claim to be specifically social process, having social content, and being solely in the service of social cognition. So cost and benefits of observational learning, self-interest in copying. How important is observational learning in comparison to non-social alternatives such as trial and error learning? 2010 assessed this question by meetings of a computer tournament in which participants proposed strategies for combining learning by observation and learning with direct experience, copying, trial and error in order to acquire adaptive behavior in a complex environment. The most successful strategy relied almost exclusively on copying. Why was copying so successful in this context? First, the observer avoids having to make errors that are an essential part of trial and error learning. In addition, because demonstrations will selectively perform the actions that they have found to be most beneficial for themselves, they effectively and inadvertently act as a filter to provide the information that is most useful for an observer. Copying is a highly adaptive means of gaining knowledge. Pro-social effects of copying. While learners from observation can serve purely short-term interest, cognition and copying can also bias us towards the long-term interest of our groups. This effect is seen in experiments which reveal subtle effects of copying. If we are covertly mimicked, we tend to like that person. Furthermore, we become more helpful to people in general. Similar effects have been demonstrated in monkeys, who are more likely to approach and share food with an imitator. These effects are likely to be unconscious. In contrast, when people are aware that they are being imitated, they experience high levels of discomfort, and thus the pro-social effects do not occur. At the neural level, there is evidence that mimicry is rewarding. When we observe someone else being imitated, activity increases in reward-related regions such as the VMPFC. When others make the same choice that we have just made merely on the basis of liking, then reward areas of the brain are activated just as when we receive the desired objects ourselves. Thus, the reward is being endorsed by others may result in reinforcing group orientation, behavior, and conformity. When is it a good idea to stop learning by observation and learn instead by trial and error? This will depend on an implicit cost-benefit analysis. As long as our own knowledge is sufficient for achieving success, we will continue to exploit that knowledge. Once that knowledge becomes unreliable, we will switch to learning by observing others. Finally, when knowledge acquired by observing others becomes unreliable, we start to explore innovative choices. This is an extension into the world of explore dichotomy used in models of reinforced learning. In observational learning, we have the trichotomy of exploit our knowledge, exploit others' knowledge, and explore. So alignment. Necessary consequence of learning by observation is the formation of behavior similarity across the population. This is most obvious in a case when learning about actions. When we interact with others, we often automatically imitate their behavior. In the case of verbal interactions, this alignment can occur at many levels. During productive discourse, speaker will automatically tend to align their posture, their speech rate, the choice of words, and syntactic forms. This alignment enhances communication. Alignment has a similar advantage for joint action where language is not involved. For example, alignment of synchronizing tapping can be manifested in mutual adjustments occurring at the level of 1 or 2 milliseconds. A group decision. Social insects such as ants and bees make successful group decisions by collating information from several individuals. One way in which such group decisions can achieve relies on learning through observation, the process through which a swarm of honeybees uses information from scouts to locate a new nesting site. The mechanism by which a group decision can be made in the absence of any central coordination is an example of the more general principle of herding, through which complex group behaviors can emerge from simple local interactions, which can occur automatically and without awareness. In humans, Dyer and colleagues have shown that few informed individuals, the equivalent of scouts in the case of bees, can guide a group to a target without verbal communication or any obvious signaling. Group identity. There is a value to learning about people as types as opposed to people as individuals. It provides prior knowledge to guide our behavior when confronted with someone we have never met before. Inevitably, this prior knowledge feeds into stereotypes and prejudice, and this plays a major role in in-group cohesion and conversely out-group hostility. A child might observe her mother being gracious when approached by a member of an in-group and ungracious when approached by a member of an out-group. Thus, through emotional contagion, human infants will learn to favor members of the in-group. Such prejudices are already found by the age of 3. At the neural level, prejudice and stereotype are likely to be underpinned by brain areas associated with evaluative processing. As mentioned already, conformity itself is rewarding and thus may provide a basis for both producing and confirming stereotypic behavior. Of great relevance to the study of group conformity is over-imitation. Children and chimpanzees have been studied when they learn by observation how to open a puzzle box and get rewarded. The model of these studies performs additional actions that are irrelevant for getting the reward. Nevertheless, children of 3 to 5 years persist in imitating the irrelevant actions, even in situations where there are countervailing task demands and even in the face of direct warnings. Chimpanzees are much less likely to imitate the irrelevant components of the action and go to the reward as quickly as possible. Adult humans perform the task with even more emphasis on conformity with the irrelevant actions than children. This faithfully copying of actions, which overrides getting a primary reward by other means, is a striking feature of human culture and provides a means for creating distinct group identities. Fascinating. Learning about other minds. So taking account of other individuals. Arguably the most important and valuable aspect of social cognition is to do with learning about other agents, not just as types, but as individuals. Stereotypes often result in inaccurate predictions and do not take account of changeable predispositions. The relevant cognitive processes in dyadic interaction have been extensively investigated by social psychologists, and an account of their likely neural basis can be found in the review by Lieberman and colleagues. Here we shall consider changeable attributes of others, such as current status, beliefs, knowledges, and intentions, attributes that need to be continually updated. How is it possible to keep track of the status of several individuals at the same time? The term keeping track of is a spatial metaphor. However, it may actually reflect the evolutionary origins of the mechanisms involved. Many animal species, including, for example, monkeys and dolphins, emit sound as they move about in groups foraging for food. It is important for their survival that everyone in the group keeps in close contact, but they cannot necessarily see each other. The problem can be solved if all group members emit frequent calls. If these calls are sufficiently individualistic, then each member of the group knows roughly where the individuals are. The implication of this idea is that each individual has an internal map of the relative locations of the other members of the group that is continually updated. Similar principle can be applied to aspects of individuals in the groups other than their position in space. For example, the relative status of the individual in the group can be represented spatially by distances along the line. For humans, at least, status does not seem to be represented in this way. Differences in both numeric magnitude and social status scale with activity in the inferior parietal cortex. Knowledge of status also helps to keep track of who is currently allied with whom. We also need to keep track of who has the most relevant knowledge. Young children, at first, are mainly concerned with learning by observing their parents, whom they trust implicitly. However, from age 8, they switch to copying the local expert instead. Tracking past behavior to predict future actions. The human face provides many clues as to how that person will behave. First, there's the emotional expression that is reflected in the continually changing configuration of a face. From this information, we could tell whether a person is fearful or happy, even if we have never met the person before. Many studies have now demonstrated this can happen in the absence of any awareness of expression. Another kind of information can also be inferred from the faces of unfamiliar people through fixed configuration of the face, such as the width of the jaw. This information relates to dispositions like dominance and trustworthiness. Third kind of information relates to the faces of people we know. When we recognize that this is the face of someone we know from past experience with this individual, how he's likely to behave through our interactions, we continue to update this knowledge, and it is our knowledge of this person that is more important than their facial appearance. There is some validity to the beliefs we have about personality of our friends. There's much greater agreement about the personality traits of an individual between close acquaintances of the individual than between strangers who have interacted with the individual only once. This ability may depart on association learning mechanisms through which we locate everyone we know in a personality space, with these locations being continually updated. We also implicitly learn from subtle cues in social interactions. Imagine playing the game rock, paper, scissors. Some cases, the behavior your opponent enables you to predict what the response will be. For example, a very brief eyebrow movement might consistently precede the choice of stone. Such cues have been learned since participants are more likely to win on such trials. The effect was observed even in participants who had no idea which cue had been predictive, as revealed in a debriefing session after the game. Learning about people can certainly occur without awareness. Such learning is likely to be procedural and semantic, association learning rather than episodic. This is suggested by the observation that patients with amnesia associated with hippocampal damage can acquire this kind of person knowledge, but only if the damage does not extend to the amygdala and the temporal pole. There's also some evidence that person's knowledge is accessed automatically when we see a familiar face. Once a particular kind of behavior has been associated with a face, that the mere presentation of that face explicits strong brain activity than a novel face. Such activity was observed in anterior paracingulate cortex and the STS, whatever the nature of the specific behavior associated with the face. We would speculate that this reflects taking an intentional stance towards people we know. As yet, however, we lack models of how persons' representations are rapidly updated in the brain. Reputation and audience effect. Tracking of reputation and the audience effect seems to be a feature of species whose interactions are characterized by direct reciprocity. For example, clients of the reef cleaner fish eavesdrop on cleaning sessions and spend more time next to cleaners known to be cooperative. Furthermore, the cleaners behave more cooperatively when they're being observed. The audience effect means that we behave differently when we believe ourselves to be observed. For example, to ensure that others will continue to cooperate with us, we need to maintain our own reputation for being cooperative. Cooperative behavior rapidly declines in trust games where the players are anonymous. Under conditions of anonymity, there is no longer any need to guard one's reputation. On the other hand, a watching pair of eyes, even in the form of a photograph, is sufficient to increase pro-social behavior. This is presumably an automatic effect since people would be well aware that a photograph cannot record their behavior or damage their reputation. The evidence for audience effects in the cleaner fish suggests that these effects need not depend on complex cognitive processes. However, such high-level processes are likely to have an additional role in humans. Social psychologists have long studied the processes by which the presence of an audience improves performance. In addition to the role for increased arousal in the presence of others, there is also evidence that the presence of an audience increases reflective self-focus and attention to ideal behavioral standards. How do humans keep track of the trustworthiness of others? This question has been investigated using economic games such as the iterative prisoner's dilemma or trust games. These studies show that the brain's reward system is activated by reciprocated cooperation and also by fair behavior. Participants in the study 2010 rapidly learned about the cooperativeness and fairness of the people they were playing with during a trust game involving iterative exchanges. Positive reciprocity robustly activated VSDR and MOFCs. An earlier study by Singer and colleagues, 2004, using a similar paradigm, the mere presentation of the face of a cooperative partner elicited activity in reward areas. 2010, scanned participants while they made self-disclosures. Activities in MPFC during self-disclosure was greatly enhanced by the presence of an audience. Activity was also observed in VSDR when self-disclosure was made in the presence of an audience. It's plausible from these observations that we keep track of the reputation for cooperativeness of individual people using the same fundamental learning mechanisms that we use to learn about what to approach and what to avoid. 2008 specifically investigated the mechanism by which we update this knowledge. In this study, the reliability of human advisors continually varied during a learning task. Here, the reliability of the advisor was not concerned with reciprocating trust, but with providing information about where a reward was likely to be found. The results suggest that some computational mechanism was engaged for tracking the location of the reward. As for tracking the reliability of the advisor, associative learning update dated through prediction errors. However, while prediction errors associated with learning error were associated with activity in the VSDR, those related to social learning were associated with activity in the MPFC and temporal junction, regions previously associated with mentalizing, and the ability to keep track of mental states of others. Tracking mental states, while experience of their past behavior can help us to predict what people are likely to do next in various situations, we can do better. It is extremely useful to know something about the current intentions, their current knowledge, and their current beliefs. Since these mental states are variable, keeping track of them enhances the accuracy of our predictions. For example, people will not reach for something they cannot see, and their actions will be determined more by what they believe to be the case rather than what is actually the case. Thus, for successful interactions, we need to keep track of people's continually changing goals, knowledge, and beliefs. There is increasingly evidence that keeping track of these mental states also occurs automatically and without the need for awareness. So tracking other points of view, 2010, shown that the mere presence of another agent slowed down observers when they had to report on a number of dots visible in the room, and when the other agent could not see all of the dots. Their results suggest that we automatically take note of the fact that others may have different knowledge due to their different point of view. The idea is that this process is automatic was confirmed by a subsequent experiment looking at the effects of cognitive load. The addition of a cognitive load did not stop participants automatically taking note of the observer's perspective. Rather, cognitive load impaired participants' capacity to take on their own and the avatar's perspective. When explicitly required to do so, we automatically keep track of the knowledge of others, but needs cognitive effect to deliberately take their perspective. Dawning awareness into the effortful process seemed to occur between the ages 2 and 4. Tracking false beliefs, there's evidence that it's possible not only to automatically keep track of what other people see, but also what they believe. The critical insight here is the recognition that people's behavior is determined by their beliefs rather than their physical reality. This insight is a result of mentalizing or having a theory of mind. While the latter label suggests a conscious process, it is important to bear in mind that there is both an implicit and explicit version of theory of mind, and this is why we prefer the term mentalizing. Why it is useful to track other people's belief about the state of the world. This knowledge allows you to predict what they're going to do much better than if you used your own belief about the world. Children from around the age of 4 to 6 years are fully aware that their own beliefs and others' beliefs of the same state of affairs can be interestingly different. They can also work out the implications, and with greater experience, adolescents and adults are increasingly able to manipulate other people's beliefs through persuasion and teaching, but also through deception and bluffing. There's now evidence that already in the first and second year of life, infants have an implicit recognition of false belief. These results suggest that the infants automatically note when someone has a different belief from themselves. There is increasing evidence for the ability to keep track of knowledge of others in non-human animals, including birds, although there's still controversy as to whether this is the case of chimpanzees. Presumably, different mechanisms support these implicit forms of mentalizing from those involved in explicit forms, but systemic distinctions between these implicit and explicit mechanisms have yet to be delineated. Below, we give examples of the usefulness of implicit tracking of beliefs in young infants. As shown, there was spontaneous helping behavior and the ability to understand and use ostensive gestures to benefit from pedagogy. So, as yet know very little about the physiological underpinnings of implicit processes by which we keep track of the mental states of others. There is a large literature on mentalizing texts implicit in MPFC and TPJ and PSTS, but these studies involve explicit processes. There are also several studies on visual perspective taking. Many of these implicate TPJ, but here again only for explicit processes. The mechanisms underlying mentalizing are likely to involve the same predictive coding principles as are involved in vision. On the basis of an estimated intention, the behavior of the agent is predicted. The estimated intention can be updated on the basis of prediction error. Activity in PS3 reflects such prediction errors. 6 costs and benefits of learning about other people's minds. Cost and benefits of learning about other people's minds, the dark side of mentalizing. Corvids, who shows implicit mentalizing, use this ability in selfish and antisocial ways. Its main purpose seems to avoid sharing food with other corvids. There are many parallels in human societies. Getting the better of others through scheming and lying is typical for human societies, and Machiavellism has been used to describe the main outcome of mentalizing. However, at the same time, mentalizing abilities, both implicit and explicit, are used in the service of reciprocal communication and cooperation. Helping behavior. Helping is extremely widespread among social animals and does not depend on keeping track of others' mental states. However, human infants show evidence of a more refined and flexible helping behavior. For example, infants of 18 months spontaneously help an adult by opening the cupboard door when the adult's hands were full. Chimpanzees also showed some evidence of this kind of helping behavior, but in a much reduced form. Another study, 2007, showed that infants of 12 months would point more often to an object whose location an adult did not know than to an object whose location she did know. Again, such helpful actions depend on infants keeping track of what others know. Mutual trust. One of the main social beneficial effects of keeping track of other minds is enhanced and flexible cooperation, as predicted by the formal evolutionary theory. 1981, we seem to expect, at least to start with, that our partner in a game will be cooperative. Furthermore, if trust can be established, then players will do better. The mechanism underlying trust building through tracking of a partner's intention to cooperate, studied 2003. In this game, a small reward is gained by catching a rabbit, and this can be obtained whatever the other person does. A much bigger reward can be obtained by catching the stag, and this reward is only obtainable if both partners choose to cooperate. But there is always a risk that your partner will not cooperate. Successful cooperation in this game depends on making inferences about the belief of your partner and also making inference about what your partner believes about you. This is an example of the recursive process that seems to lie at the heart of many human social interactions. According to a recently developed computational model of this game, players need to estimate the depth of inference being made by their partner in order to optimize success in the game. This suggests that the model is also relevant to reciprocal communication. Referred to closing the loop, reciprocal communication plays an important role in teaching, as both teacher and learner need to keep track of the differences in their stated knowledge. However, whether these processes are implicit or explicit remains to be determined. Scanning study 2010 found that the activity in the MPFC was related to participants' uncertainty about their partner's depth of inference. We believe the approach offered by computational fMRI using models such as the one applied to the stag hunt game could lead to a much more precise formulation of the role of brain regions involved in mentalizing. Explicit processes in social cognition and their mechanisms. Clearly, many processes associated with social cognition occur automatically and without awareness. We have shown that these are typically present in many species, including humans, and are also present in very young human infants. What is there left to do for explicit processes? We will suggest a particular role for explicit processes in fostering social interactions, which may be unique to humans, and these processes are characterized not simply by awareness, but by reflective awareness. By this, we mean the metacognitive ability to think about our thinking. We'll argue that it is through reflective awareness that humans manage to outstrip the performance of other social species. So top-down modulation of competing implicit processes. It is a truism that our senses are bombarded by many signals from which just a few must be selected for controller actions. This selection can be achieved bottom-up by direct competition between many different signals. However, it can also be achieved top-down by prior biases that are applied to some signals and not to others. This is the bias competition model, whose neural basis has been analyzed in some detail. Same principles apply to social information. Executive control of social cognition. There's a continual competition between the various implicit processes relevant to social interactions, such as self-interest versus group interest, short-term gain versus long-term gain. The competition could also be biased by top-down executive processes. One important role for the executive processes to overcome biases such as race prejudice. We all tend to have an implicit fear of out-group members and fail to show empathy for people of the out-group. For example, if white observers are shown the faces of unknown black people for 30 milliseconds, activity is typically elicited in the amygdala. This result occurs with such a short presentation time suggests that the processing of the face occurs without awareness. However, the amygdala activity is correlated with measures of the strength of the observer's implicit race prejudice. However, the faces are shown for 525 milliseconds. Then activity is elicited in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala response is reduced. This result suggests that explicit executive processes instantiated in the frontal cortex can modulate the automatic evaluation of people. More direct evidence for a role for executive processes in resolving conflicts between different social processes. In 2010 study, participants were scanned while making inferences about the emotional states of agents. Relevant information was available from two sources: silent video clips of people depicting positive or negative autobiographical events, and written sentences describing such events. The idea was that the video clips would activate the brain's mirror system, while the sentences would engage the brain's mentalizing system. The pattern of brain activity associated with these different cues confirmed the expectation, and the incongruent condition activity was elicited in areas associated with executive control, and there was also evidence that this control was associated with biasing towards the participants' preferred source of information. These results demonstrate that social processes are subject to top-down executive control using the same mechanisms as non-social processes. Verbal instructions. Just as we can learn by observing others, we can also learn from what others tell us. Work from Malinsky's group shows that reputation conveyed through word of mouth can have a strong effect on group behavior. In a trust game, an effect was found even when participants could access the same information by direct observation. The same effect can be observed at the natural level. 2005 found that participants would make more risky investment choices with partners when they had been told that the partners had a good reputation. In addition, in this case, the activation of the caudate nucleus that normally reflects whether the partner cooperates or defects on a trial-by-trial basis was significantly reduced. The indirect spreading of information about others is known as gossip and is an important part of human communications. It seems that gossip reduces our reliance on the feedback mechanism underlying trial and error learning as a typical of top-down mechanisms. Verbal instruction can also affect how we respond to objects, not just people. The instruction, when you see the blue square, you will receive at least one shock, is sufficient to induce fear of the blue square. But in this case, the fear object does not elicit a response when presented subliminally. It seems that learning through verbal instruction depends on explicit top-down brain processes. They do not establish an automatic response to objects that we believe to be threatening, but of which we have no direct experience. Teaching. Most human learning arguably occurs through deliberate teaching rather than mere observation and is greatly dependent on the use of language. However, the human advantage of learning from a teacher extends even to situations in which language is not involved. Teaching in the broad sense understood as actively helping the learner to benefit from the teacher's experience has been observed in a variety of animals, including ants and bees. 2011, vivid example. To kill and eat a scorpion without being stung requires considerable skill. So the mother prepares this food in line with their pups, gradually increasing abilities. Through such teaching, a young meerkat learns to kill a scorpion in such a way that they draw the deadly sting first. This kind of instruction does not depend on keeping track of constantly changing mental states. Instead, it's finely attuned to the physical states of the young. These stages are signaled by the pitch of vocalization of the pups. It is this vocalization that triggers the adult's food-preparing behavior. We'd argue that in humans, the continuous track of mental states enables a more flexible type of interaction, referred to as natural pedagogy. In adult-infant interactions in particular, a deliberate and explicit teaching occurs with both adult and infants knowing when teaching is intended. This usually involves ostensive gestures such as eye contact or high-pitched speech mode of motherese. In such interaction, the infant is not simply learning by observation. A shared intention has been found between the adult and the infant, and importantly, also the object of their intention. Intriguingly, we all expect, infants included, that we are taught about the object, not about a fleeting and precise moment of interpersonal interaction. In this way, we're continuously teaching each other and learning from each other about the world. Teaching here is cooperative activity in which social games would also be examples. 2006 study, 18 to 24-month children engaged in cooperative games with adults. At one point in these games, the adult partner stopped participating. All the children made at least one communicative attempt to re-engage the adult. Here it is the infant rather than the adult who is using the ostensive gesture to restart the interaction. In contrast to human infants, the chimpanzees in the study never made any communicative attempt to re-engage their partner. We are aware of only 2 explorations on the neural basis of ostensive communicative gestures. 2003 found that both eye contact with a participant and calling the participant's name both elicited activity in anterior rostral medial prefrontal cortex, and that the temporal pose both regions associated with mentalizing. Another study investigating brain activity elicited when communication through pointing at an object compared to just pointing at an object without the intention to communicate. In this study, when pointing was communicative, the pointer subtly altered their behavior to take account of the point of view of the observer. The brain regions specifically activated by communicative pointing were right PSTS and right MPFC. As we've seen, activity in MPFC seems to be elicited in many situations when we need to think about mental states. 2006 study, participants were presented with a series of sentences describing a person. Some of the sentences were informative as to the personality of the person, while others were not. When the task was to form an impression of the person, both kinds of sentences elicited activity in the MPFC. However, when the task was simply to remember the order of the people, only the sentence relevant to personality activated the MPFC. So we speculate that an instruction to form an impression was a form of ostensive signal, indicating that the sentences that followed would be relevant in this task. The activity of the MPFC reflects the adoption by participants of mentalizing stance towards all subsequent information. In the absence of such instruction, only the sentence about personality elicited the stance. This is consistent with the idea that MPFC has a high-level role in top-down biasing towards treating information as socially relevant. This speculation is also consistent with the various studies where greater activity was elicited in MPFC when subjects were told they were interacting with a person rather than a computer. Even more specific role in the brain region consistent with activation by extensive gestures and by the presence of an audience might be linking mental states of the self and the partner during communicative interactions. In line with these observations, 2006 study suggested that cognitive processes supported by the MPFC may be uniquely human form of social cognition. So 8, sharing experience, the importance of metacognition. Sharing experience, the importance of metacognition, reflective discussion. We have suggested that there's an important distinction between learning through observation of others, which can occur without explicit awareness, and learning through explicit communication with others. We have discussed gossip, through which we learn about the reputation of others, and instruction, through which we are taught about objects in the world. In this final section, we will discuss another major topic of explicit communicative interactions. We will refer to it as reflective discussion. We frequently talk to each other about our mental states, describing our sensory experience and justifying our decisions. Such interactions would be impossible without special high-level ability, metacognition, which may well be uniquely human. Metacognition is the ability to reflect upon the mental states and describe these states to others. The self-reflection requires a step away from the representations of the world and other people, and this step appears to be a mental decoupling. We are normally unaware of our representations of the world. Instead, we take for granted that the world is an open book directly accessible to our experiences. Metacognition allows reflection and can give us a rare glimpse into the fragility of our own mental world. This makes it possible for us to recognize representations as just that, representations. For this, it follows that other minds may have different representations, and even more startling, that our representations of the world might be illusory or false. Since we are all able to have these insights, we can discuss them. Thus, reflective discussions enable us to compare our views of the world and to create improved shared views of the world. In this way, metacognition has a vital role in the generation of cultural values and institutions. Reflective discussions of action changes behavior. A major feature of our mental life involves the vivid experience of being in control of our actions and choosing one option rather than another. Yet this experience seems to be largely post-hoc and has little to do with actual control. We believe that the value of this experience arises because we can discuss the sources of our action with others. People readily explain and justify their decisions, even though these explanations and justifications may be inaccurate and self-serving. 2005 study shown how readily people will justify choice even when, unbeknown to them, it was not the choice they actually made. The importance of such discussions with other people is that they enable us to better understand the factors that determine our own decisions and can change the way we make decisions in the future. Reflective discussions of sensations create a more accurate model of the world. In humans, the explicit metacognitive process of sharing sensory experience enables pairs of participants to enhance their perception of basic sensory signals, even beyond the abilities of a better member of the pair. So 2010 studied pairs of participants collaborating in the performance of a signal detection task. If the pair disagreed as to whom the signal was presented, then they had to come up with a joint decision through discussion. As long as the members of the dyad had relatively similar perceptual ability, the group performance was significantly better than the better member of the pair. Moreover, this group advantage critically depended upon the occurrence of the discussion. We believe that this advantage depends on one or all of the following components. First, the partners need to reflect on their performance. Second, they need to be able to convey to each other their confidence in which they observe. And third, they have to be able to compare their reflections. The neural basis of metacognition. The exploration of the neural basis of our metacognition abilities has barely begun. However, the frontal cortex is clearly implicated in relation to the perception. The bilateral implication of the TMS to the DLPFC has a specific effect on confidence in perception and affecting discrimination. This suggests that the TMS can cause a reduction in metacognitive sensitivity, presumably by increasing neural noise in PFC. Lesions of prefrontal cortex are also associated with greater effects on subjective report than on objective performance. Individuals can differ considerably in their metacognitive sensitivity, even when they do not differ perceptual sensitivity. People with greater metacognitive sensitivity in a perceptual task have a greater density of gray matter in the anterior prefrontal cortex. In relation to the action and the experience of agency, 2004 found that the requirement to make reports about the intention to act was associated with activity in pre-supplemental motor area. More recently, 2011 has taken the study of action considerably further, relaying brain regions related to hierarchy of cognition processes underlying metacognition. In this study, right TPJ activity was associated with the detection of discrepancies between expected and observed states, while activity in the pre-SMA and rostral ACC was associated with being in control of one's actions. However, judgments of control were associated with activity in anterior prefrontal cortex, a location close to that identified as relevant to perceptual metacognition in the study 2010. It remains to be explored whether or not there is an intimate relationship between metacognition and the executive process associated with prefrontal cortex, through which competing automatic social processes are modulated. One possibility is that the biases of competition exerted by top-down control requires explicit representations of the processes that are competing for the controlled behavior. To conclude, in this essay, we've emphasized the importance of comparisons of different species and the use of evolutionary framework for understanding social interaction. Much of human social behavior derives from the same range of cognitive processes that can also be seen in other social animals. We distinguish mechanisms for processes and suggest that this is largely general mechanisms that enable specifically social processes. That is, many of the underlying mechanisms can also be used to solve problems without social content or social aims. There are a very large variety of social processes for observational learning and copying to mentalizing and reflective discussion. We found that we share some but not all with other species, and that many of the processes are implicit and automatic. For instance, the mere presence of other biases us towards group-oriented behavior, and our behavior is automatically influenced in the presence of others with a different perspective. We also share with other social species the ability automatically to keep track of the agents we are interacting with, their status and predispositions. There are hints of this ability may derive from spatial tracking ability. We suggest that mentalizing this is tracking intentions, knowledge, and beliefs of others, may depend on predictive coding mechanisms. In the case of other species, tracking others' mental states appears to be limited to certain domains of interest, for instance, food coaching and corvids. In the case of humans, we are continually updating our representations of other people's dispositions, emotions, intentions, point of view, knowledge, and belief. Though complex, much of this updating also appears to be automatic and explicit. What then is social cognition is specific to human beings? First, through language, humans have the means of creative processes that are explicit. Second, humans, in comparison to other species, have a greater ability to exert top-down control over automatic processes. This is particularly important when there is competition between different components of social cognition. Third, humans have the extraordinary power to reflect upon their own mental states. This is a prime example of metacognition, which may well lie at the heart of conscious awareness. Finally, how do we do the explicit, controllable, and metacognitive abilities that human beings can put to use in the service of social cognition benefit social interaction? We believe that our specific communicative abilities, both verbal and nonverbal, greatly enhance the value of our social interactions. Unlike other animals, humans teach and learn in a deliberately interactive manner and can explicitly share intentions and experiences. Learning by instruction can often be more efficient than learning by observation. The ability to discuss and share mental states is perhaps the most valuable of the social processes we discussed. This ability to share experiences can enhance the accuracy of the models of the world that we construct and thus our potential to make better decisions. It is this uniquely human kind of social cognition that makes possible joint endeavors such as cultural institutions, arts, and science. Central points. Social cognition needs to explain the use of social cues for selfish interest and for group-directed altruistic behavior. Even altruistic behavior serves self-interest in the long term. The automatic effect of social cues usually increases pro-social tendencies. The action of social cues is seen in the audience in the chameleon effect. Learning by observation is largely automatic, widespread, and has many advantages over trial and error. It has benefits for the individual who can avoid making errors and make use of others' experience. It is also of benefit for the group by making individuals more similar. However, for exploration and novelty, trial and error learning may be necessary. Gossip is an important means to gauge the reliability of potential partners and feeds into reputation management. There is pressure for reputation management to facilitate trust and cooperation, as well as to punish those who break trust. This is usually an automatic process and seen in social animals who use the mechanism of indirect reciprocity to balance selfish and group interest. In the framework of neuroeconomics, there is a never-ending arms race between investors and free riders. Mentalizing is likely to be based on predictive coding. This mechanism is carried by a network of frontal and temporal parietal regions of the brain. An implicit form of mentalizing is observed in infants under 12 months, and homologous forms have been observed in other species. The explicit form of mentalizing is linked to the development of metacognition and language and is unique to human beings, universally present from about 4 to 6 years. Classic false belief test explicit mentalizing looking behavior is used to test implicit mentalizing. An implicit form of teaching young infants is signaled by ostension, deliberate instruction, in which both pupil and teacher are aware of the intention to teach, is abundant in human societies from when children are aged 4 to 6. Many networks of social brain mentalizing, metacognition, mirroring languages are involved. Metacognition plays a crucial role in human society interaction and provides a basis for human consciousness. Consciously applied top-down processes can control automatic processes. Prefrontal regions of the human brain and their connections to other cortical regions are thought to be crucial in this control. So future issues to study: find a principal distinction between implicit and explicit processes at the cognitive experimental level. Find a principal distinction between accidental signals that are broadcast publicly and deliberate signals of communication. Use computational models of mentalizing combined with neural imaging to lead to a better understanding of the mechanisms involved. Elucidate the relationship between metacognition and executive function. Elucidate the role of metacognition in social interaction. Comparison of group decisions making as social insects and humans will be important for revealing underlying mechanisms. Study how conflicts are resolved between the use of social signals for our own selfish benefit and for group-oriented behavior. Okay, great study. Glad to get through that. So I'm going to read through one more study, finishing up here. So I have this other study on human volition. Patrick Haggard. Human volition towards the neuroscience of free will. The capacity for voluntary action is seen as essential to human nature, yet neuroscience and behavioral psychology have traditionally dismissed the topic as unscientific, perhaps because the mechanisms that cause actions have long been unclear. However, new research has identified networks of brain areas, including the presupplementary motor area, the anterior prefrontal cortex, and the parietal cortex that underlie voluntary action. These areas generate information for forthcoming actions, and also cause the distinctive conscious experience of intending to act and then controlling one's own actions. Volition consists of a series of decisions regarding whether to act, what action to perform, and when to perform it. Neuroscience accounts of voluntary action may inform debates about the nature of individual responsibility. So most adult humans have a strong feeling of voluntary control over their actions and of acting as they choose. The capacity for voluntary action is so fundamental to our existence that social constraints on it, such as imprisonment or prohibition of certain actions, are carefully justified and heavily regulated. Equally, disorder of voluntary actions, such as psychosis, are features of many psychiatric and neurological conditions. Despite this importance, it is difficult to provide a satisfactory account of what makes a particular action voluntary. A dualistic view of endogenous causation is ingrained in our normal language. Everyday language suggests that I consciously choose to perform action and that my choice somehow causes the action to occur. This language is dualistic. It implies a mental I that is distinct from both the brain and the body, but that can nevertheless trigger brain events and thus bodily movement. Scientifically more satisfactory approach defines voluntary action by contrasting it with stimulus-driven actions. Voluntary action lies at one end of the continuum that has simple reflexes at the other end. Thus, whether reflexes are immediate motor responses, the form of which is determined by the form of stimulation, the occurrence, timing, and form of voluntary actions are not directly determined, or at best are only very indirectly determined by any identifiable external stimulus. Voluntary actions thus demonstrate a freedom from immediacy. Stimulus independence makes voluntary action hard to study experimentally. This review first describes some of the issues that are involved in measuring volition. It then considers brain circuits that are involved in voluntary action and outlines a view of voluntary action that is based on how these circuits could make decisions in situations in which actions are underdetermined. Finally, it considers the relations between voluntary action and consciousness. Measuring volition. Experimental studies generally deliver a known input or stimulus to a system and measure the system's response. However, the approach is incompatible with the concept of voluntary action being stimulus independent. To resolve this problem, most experimental studies have given a stimulus or instruction that only partly determines what a participant should do in one of three ways. The participant performs a fixed action but chooses when to do so. The participant performs an action at a specified time but chooses which of a number of actions to perform, or the participant chooses whether or not to perform an action. Most studies can be criticized for failing to capture the context of natural human volition. In particular, there is in these studies generally no reason or value that motivates the participant to choose one action over another. In addition, instructing a person to be voluntary is rather paradoxical. However, such studies do capture key computational features of the voluntary action, namely that these participants must themselves generate the information that is needed to perform an action. A recent radical view effectively dismisses voluntariness as a social constructed artifact of the experimental situation rather than a genuine cognitive process. From this view, a typical instruction is voluntary action studies effectively invite participants to behave in a way that reflects their understanding of free will. Participants might interpret this as a requirement for randomness over trials, leading them to monitor their own performance and selectively vary it. However, these criticisms focus on repeated iterative choice and do not undermine the concept of generating information for an occasional individual action. Contrasting voluntary actions with reflex actions provides several useful neuroscientific pointers. Voluntary actions involve the cerebral cortex, whereas some reflexes are purely spinal. Volition matures late in individual development, whereas reflexes can be present at or before birth. Finally, voluntary actions involve two distinct subjective experiences that are generally absent from reflexes, either experience of intention, that is planning to do or being about to do something, and the experience of agency, which is the later feeling that one's action has indeed caused a particular external event. For example, a person who switches on a light might experience the intention to perform the action at a particular moment. When the light goes on, the person attributes this change to their action and so experience confirmation that they caused this external event. By contrast, when a physically similar movement is evoked by a reflex, such as a knee jerk, the experience of intention and control are both absent. So for example, you observe a clock, note the clock position at time of conscious intention, perform an action, hitting a button, and report clock position at time of conscious intention. This is the famous Liebet half-second delay. So the readiness potential versus time. The Liebet described an experiment that seems to disprove the everyday concept of free will. The method is an adaptation of Wundt's classical techniques. Participants watch a spot or clock hand rotating on the screen. At the time of their own choosing, they spontaneously make a movement of the right hand. The clock stops after a random interval, and the participant reports the position of the clock hand at the moment when they first felt the urge to move their hand. At the same time, electrodes placed on the scalp record the activity of prefrontal motor areas in preparing the movement. The schematic readiness potential recorded in this way is shown in the figure. On average, participants reported the conscious intention to act 206 milliseconds before onset of muscle activity. By contrast, preparatory brain activity could begin 1 second or more before the movement. Therefore, the brain clearly prepared the action over a considerable period before the participant became aware of the intention to act. Diagram. So Liebet's experiment has been widely discussed and extensively criticized, but also replicated. One objection is that the real voluntary action is the participant's decision to join the experiment in the first place, and that is the process associated with the action rather than the feeling of being about to move that provides the experimental data. Other objections emphasize that the subjective estimates of when conscious experience occur are unreliable. For example, results may vary according to how the participant divides intention between the clock and their own motor preparation. Indeed, the brain frequently manufactures conscious experience after the event, retro-inserting them into the stream of consciousness. Continuum between reflexes and voluntary actions would require intermediate cases. Humans and other animals readily learn to associate motor responsive with arbitrary sensory stimuli, such as green and red lights, respectively signaling stop and go. When a person starts crossing a road in response a green signal, the timing and form of their action is related to the stimulus. On the other hand, the action might not occur every time the stimulus occurs. Specifically, its occurrence depends on whether the person wants to cross the road and perhaps on whether the person has some reason to do so. Therefore, responses to external stimuli usually have features of both reflex action and voluntary actions. The development of the association cortex in recent evolution has allowed motor responses to link the stimuli not only directly as an object-oriented actions like grasping, but also arbitrary flexibility and conditionally. Voluntary actions could simply refer to the limiting case of particularly intelligent responses to situations and contexts. However, the view that voluntary actions are in some special sense is supported by evidence for distinct neural pathways associated with voluntary action and stimulus-driven action, as discussed in the next section. So brain circuits for voluntary action. The human primate brain contains several distinct cortical motor circuits that contribute to voluntary action. These circuits converge on the primary motor cortex, which executes motor commands by transmitting them to the spinal cord and muscles. The motor cortex was therefore considered to be the final common path for voluntary action. It receives two broad classes of input, which subserve voluntary and stimulus-driven actions respectively. More recent work suggests that other cortical motor areas also send outputs to the spinal cord. However, many of these show similar preferences for voluntary and stimulus-driven actions, suggesting that there is a fundamental distinction in the cortical organization of an action. One key input reaches M1 from the presupplementar motor areas, which in turn receive input from the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex. Several human neuroimaging studies compared the brain activity for manual actions performed at a time of the participant's choice with that for similar actions performed in response to external stimulus. These showed stronger activation in the pre-SMA for self-paced actions than for externally triggered actions. The pre-SMA forms part of a wider frontal cognitive motor network that includes the premotor, the cingulate, and the frontopolar cortices. The role of the pre-SMA is confirmed by the recordings from the scalp electrodes, which showed a prolonged and increasing negativity that begins 1 second or more before the onset of voluntary movement. The source of the early part of this readiness potential has been localized in the pre-SMA. The onset of the readiness potential is often seen as the initiation of a cascade of neural activity that spreads from the pre-SMA back to the SMA proper in M1, thus causing movement. However, this view has methodological and theoretical difficulties. First, readiness potentials are measured as voltage increases relative to neural baselines period before the activity of interest. In stimulus locked recordings, the baseline is normally taken just before stimulus delivery. But what would be the correct baseline before voluntary action? This is an important question because deciding on a baseline presupposes that one knows when the neural precursors of action begin. In practice, preparatory brain activity may begin as early as researchers are able to look for it. For example, recent attempts to decode free choices using new algorithms suggest that neural preparation begins much earlier than was previously thought. Second, the preparatory activity of the pre-SMA must itself be caused. The brain circuits for voluntary action might consist of loops rather than linear chains that run back to the unspecified and uncaused cause, so the will. Indeed, the input from the basal ganglia to the pre-SMA is thought to play a major part in the initiation of action. For example, patients with Parkinson's disease in whom the output for the basal ganglia to the pre-SMA is reduced show less frequency and slower actions than healthy controls. Moreover, signals that predict a forthcoming voluntary response can be recorded some 2 seconds before movement onset from electrodes implanted in the basal ganglia. These signals thus precede the typical onset time of readiness potentials. The subcortical loop through the basal ganglia integrates a wide range of cortical signals to drive currently appropriate actions, whereas dopaminergic inputs from the substantia nigra to the stratum provide the possibility to modulate this drive according to the patterns of reward. From this view, voluntary action is better characterized as a flexible and intelligent interaction with the animal's current and historical context than as an uncaused initiation action. The basal ganglia pre-SMA circuit has a key role in the process. By contrast, the second cortical network that converges on M1 plays a part in immediate sensory guidance of actions. Information from early sensory cortices is relayed to the intermediate level representations in the parietal lobe and thence to the lateral part of the premotor cortex, which projects in turn to the M1. This parietal premotor circuit guides object-oriented actions such as grasping using current sensory input, delays as little as 1 second before stimulus presentation and motor response result in a switch away from the dorsal root towards other circuits. However, recent studies suggest that this circuit also contributes to some aspect of voluntary behavior. For example, single unit recordings from the primate intraparietal suckless and task in which the animal must choose between equally rewarding alternatives show that neurons in the lateral intraparietal area might encode the specific behavior outcome that the animal has chosen. Thus, when immediate action is required, the parietal premotor circuit might arbitrate between action alternatives, whereas the absence of immediate instruction, the basal ganglia pre-SMA circuit might be more involved in initiating actions. The two circuits could thus implement different kinds of decisions, both of which are relevant to human volition. Voluntary action is decision-making. The introduction described how everyday language views voluntary action as a moment of endogenous mental choice. In fact, volition is better described as a set of processes in the specific brain circuits described above. These processes jointly specify several kinds of information that determine our actions, so voluntary action is therefore a form of decision-making. Decisions about action differ from perceptual decisions in several ways. Action decisions such as should I do something and how should I do it are typically ill-posed in the sense that they allow several possible solutions. Many perceptual decisions, by contrast, involve reducing complex stimulus information to simpler descriptions. The motor brain must generate new information to make action decisions, where the perceptual brain needs only to process information that is already present in the stimulus. The various action decisions that lead up to the performance of voluntary action are described in the next section. So here's an example, the brain display. Brain circuits for voluntary action. The primary motor cortex receives two broad classes of inputs. One key input reaches the M1 from the supplementary motor area and the pre-supplementary motor area, which in turn receives input from the basal ganglia and the prefrontal cortex. In the second cortical network, information from early sensory cortices is relayed to the intermediate level representations in the parietal cortex, and from there to the lateral part of the premotor cortex, which projects to the M1. The parietal premotor circuit guides object-oriented actions such as grasping using current sensory input, but also contributes to some aspects of voluntary behavior. Then brain activity preceding a voluntary action of the right hand, the frontopolar cortex, they're shown in green, forms and deliberates long-range plans and intentions. The pre-supplementary motor cortex in red begins the preparation of the action. Together with the other premotor areas, it generates the readiness potential that can be recorded from the scalp immediately before the action takes place. The M1, shown in blue, becomes active. In latter stages of preparation, the collateral hemispheres is more active than the ipsilateral hemisphere. This is a reflective and lateralized difference between the readiness potentials that are recorded over the two hemispheres of the brain. Finally, neurosignals leave M1 for the spinal cord and the contralateral hand muscles. The contraction of the muscles is measured as an electric signal, the electromyogram. So simple process. Look at this other chart here of the decision. So naturalized model of human volition. Volition is modeled as a set of decision processes that each specify details of an action. The decision, whether to perform an action, whether decision has both an early and motivational component and a final predictive check. What decisions specify which goal or task from a range of tasks to perform, task selection, and the means by which to perform it, action selection. The timing of voluntary actions often depends on the combination of environmental circumstances, internal motivations, and explicit when decision is not always necessary. You see a nice chart of a when decision, combining different factors of task selection, action selection, final predictive checks, to action execution, the external environment, and back to iterative process and motivations, reason for action. Early weather decisions. If an individual's current needs are satisfied and if current stimuli are appropriately processed and responded to by routine schemas, then the individual's behavior can be explained without recourse to any concept of volition. In other cases, Behaviors clearly go beyond routine processing, such as when a new action is initiated or when an existing action pattern is withheld or modified. The brain then generates information according to a hierarchical set of decisions regarding the action. First, there's an early decision whether to make any action at all. Needs, desires, and other reasons for action have a strong role in this early decision. Voluntary actions might occur for any of these three distinct reasons. First, routine processing of stimuli can fail to generate sufficient information to determine a response. For example, when selecting between alternative actions in response to an ambiguous stimulus. Second, a new reason for action can suddenly emerge, reflecting either renewed basic needs such as hunger or new higher level desires such as desire to wave to a friend. Third, general drive to perform occasional voluntary actions would allow exploration of the behavior landscape. In one important model of cognitive control, voluntary actions that occur for any of these reasons will temporarily suspend routine stimulus-based control and switch the control of the motor apparatus from sensory to volitional input. A behavioral corollary of this switch may be the finding that reaction times for making a simple manual movement in response to a stimulus are higher when the stimulus occurs during preparation to make the movement voluntarily than when there is no preparation for the voluntary action. What decisions? Goal selection. Further key decision relates to what voluntary action to perform. In fact, this decision has two forms: selecting between goals or tasks and selecting between movements to achieve them. Although people commonly maintain several goals simultaneously, voluntary actions are generally performed in a series, so people must schedule goals by selecting between them. This aspect of action control has been largely ignored in the experimental literature, in which instructions usually specify unique tasks. Neuropsychological studies, however, describe a dysexecutive syndrome in which the order, scheduling, and interaction of several tasks might become disorganized. Deciding between motor tasks seems to involve the frontal cortex. Evidence for this comes from two neuropsychological conditions that are seen in people with frontal lobe damage, particularly damage that involves the pre-SMA. Patients who exhibit utilization behavior, compulsive grasp, and use objects in their intermediate environment. Clinical reports suggest that they select as their task whatever the most salient in their current environment, even when the object is not specifically drawn to their attention. Patients with anarchic hand syndrome, a unilateral frontal lesion, leaves the contralateral hand automatically reacting to current stimuli, even when the patient explicitly states that they will not perform the action in question. Importantly, experimental studies show that even when these patients are instructed to perform a specific motor task, movements of their affected hand are captured by competing tasks, such as reaching for distractors. Moreover, action decisions made up by patients with lesions in the area show unusual sensitivity to visual primes that were masked so as to be imperceptible. In healthy control participants, flashing a brief mask prime before reaction time task increased reaction times when the mask was compatible with the instructed stimulus, owing to automatic inhibition of motor programs that are evoked by non-predictive and irrelevant primes. By contrast, in patients with a pre-SMA lesion, mask primes speeded a subsequent motor response. This suggests that non-normal function of the pre-SMA to suppress automatic responding to current environmental stimulation, and that patients with pre-SMA damage are therefore hyper-responsive. These elegant experimental studies have the advantage that the results cannot be explained in terms of the unusual demand characteristic of the task or the patients not understanding what they are supposed to do. The patients did not consciously perceive the mask primes that influence their behavior. Taking together, such findings suggest that the frontal lobes in general and the pre-SMA in particular have a crucial role in keeping volition focused and on task, on binding intention and action. Neuroimaging studies have shown that distinct caudal and rostral subregions of the pre-SMA are respectively active in voluntary selection between alternative tasks and switching between such selections. The ready distractibility of children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder may reflect a developmental disorder of the same system. What decisions? Movement selection. Second form of what decisions involve choosing between alternative means to achieve and identify goals. Such movement decisions are clearly hierarchical, secondary to decisions about goals. Most goals can be achieved in any of the several ways, in part because the redundancy that is built into motor apparatus. In computational models of motor controls, an inverse model generates specific motor commands from a general goal description, such as reach for the object in the brain. This form of what decision is thought to involve parietal and premotor areas in the dorsal visual motor stream. Single neurons in the primate parietal cortex specify how a given target is achieved. Study of allowed monkeys to decide autonomously whether to indicate a target location by reaching to it or by making a saccada. They found that neurons in previously identified reach and saccada areas in the parietal cortex showed activity before a go signal that predicated whether the animal would subsequently reach or saccada on a particular trial. Many studies in both humans and animals have studied free choice between spatially defined responses, such as left and right key presses and leftward and rightward saccadas. The neural code that are associated with spatial distinctive actions are clearly identifiable. For example, parietal neurons have sensory receptive fields in the contralateral space, and cortical motor areas project preferentially to the contralateral hand. However, the cognitive level of these decisions is unclear. Sometimes left and right targets or responses constitute different tasks, whereas in other situations, there are simply different means of performing a single task. Perhaps for this reason, the neural activity that is associated with spatial specific decisions seems to be widespread in the brain. In the frontal motor circuitry, left-right decisions have been associated with activity in the frontal polar cortex, the pre-SMA, and the rostral cingulate cortex. They have also been associated with lateralized readiness potentials recorded over M1. Similarly, the parietal premotor circuits that are associated with goal selection are also associated with spatially specific decisions. Although left-right decisions offer a convenient method for experiments, they can be difficult to locate the functional models of the information processing that underlies volition. Recent computation models have considered how what task and what movement circuits might be linked. For example, studies show the prefrontal cortex signal bias, the activation strength of a specific movement alternative that is coded in parietal premotor circuits. Computational model of frontal lobe function has suggested that frontal polar cortex implements goal selection by branching control towards the most rewarding of the two task sets while keeping an alternative task set pending. In this model, the lateral prefrontal cortex guides actual behavior according to the current task or goal, although branching control towards most rewarding of two concurrent actions may not capture all a human voluntary action. The development of explicit computational models is a key step in developing scientific theories of volition. The late weather decisions, a final predictive check and veto. What decisions generate information that activates specific motor outputs? However, the details of these outputs may not be predictable at the time that the initial decision whether to act is taken. Moreover, several brain networks independently generate different kinds of action information, so full descriptions of an impending action can be synthesized only very late. The cost of the selected action might turn out to be high. It might be poor means to achieve the selected goal, or the task of environment might have changed. Therefore, once detailed information about voluntary action has been fully specified, a final check might occur before the motor system is committed and the gate to action executions are open. In computational models of visually guided reaching, this check is achieved by comparing the output of a predictive forward model with a goal description. The motor commands are then adjusted according to the mismatch between the two. However, the same predictive checking process could be used not only to correct actions, but also to cancel, to veto them completely. This second form of weather choices, which could be called a late weather decision, determines whether or not the action goes ahead. Most people recognize the situation of being about to say angry words or send an angry email and reframing at the last moment. Human studies of canceling action have generally focused on responses to external no-go or stop signals and include studies of externally triggered stopping of internally generated actions. Libet reported a readiness potential that was consistent with motor preparation, even on occasions in which participants decided to veto the prepared action and did not actually move. More recently, however, the neural substrate of the endogenous cancellation process itself has been identified. Brass and Haggard asked participants in a functional MRI experiment to prepare and perform simple key presses at a time of their own choosing, but to withhold the action at the last possible moment. On some trials, participants reported the time at which they felt they were about to move, even on trials in which the movement was subsequently canceled. This yielded an identifiable event for analyzing brain activity in veto trials, which lacked any overt movement. An area of the anterior frontal medial cortex, the rostral to the pre-SMA, was activated in veto trials more than in trials on which participants made an action. This activation represents the neural correlate of a late weather decision. Such decisions might play a key role in self-control and also raise the important possibility that voluntary actions can be prepared in order to stimulate them, but not execute them as is imagined action or in prediction by forward models. In addition, veto trials showed a strong activation of anterior insula consistent with the effective response to intentions that failed to drive actions. So when decisions about when to perform voluntary actions have attracted considerable attention and are an important experimental tool. Self-paced actions can be considered to be products of a when decision. Several studies have compared brain activity between self-paced conditions in which the participants themselves decides when to make an action and externally triggered conditions in which the participants makes an action in response to a stimulus. Activity in both the pre-SMA and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has been identified by this comparison. Studies that focused on voluntary action alone confirm that the timing of an action can be predicated from preparatory activity in the pre-SMA. However, when decisions in everyday life have a different form from what decisions and whether decisions outside the laboratory, the timing of voluntary action generally depends on coordinating the scheduling of other potential actions in routine processes. Whether decisions and what decisions are made continuously in an iterative loop, the timing of a specific voluntary action often depends on external circumstances and internal motivations rather than any explicit when decisions. Therefore, an apparent when decision to perform an action now can sometimes be better described as a change in the evaluation of a whether decision or a what decision. For example, deciding to quit a gambling task might not involve an explicit when decision. Rather, the cost of action might escalate to a point that a whether decision suggests inhibiting future action. Indeed, recent fMRI studies show the decision to quit and intentional inhibition have a common neural substrate in frontomedial cortex. One exception to this rule could be a time-based prospective memory, which involves an explicit when decision to perform an action at a specified time later. The anterior medial prefrontal cortex might hold intentions during a delay period between the initial decision regarding what to do and the later movement at which the action is executed. Interesting prospective memory situations particularly highlight the need for late whether decisions or veto decisions, and intention that is being maintained for last action might be dropped following re-evaluation. You see figure 3, two brain areas activated by intentional inhibition of voluntary action. The veto, so the A, top picture activation in the frontomedial cortex for the contrast of veto versus account trials, and in B, activation in the left and right anterior virtual insula for the contrast of veto versus action trials. Very interesting. Okay, general computational principles. So our schema identified the different types of decisions that lead to voluntary action, but not the general computational principles by which these decisions are made. Voluntary action as exemplary behavior. First, innovative action is a clear survival advantage, and animal success depends on the balance between exploiting known resources through routine behavior and exploring possible new resources through new actions. The generative stimulus-independent quality of voluntary action resembles exploration rather than exploitation. Recent neuroimaging evidence confirms the dissociation in the frontal lobe between ventromedial frontal areas that code expected rewards and bilateral frontopolar regions that code exploratory choices. Voluntary action is random behavioral noise. Second, intrinsic neural noise ensures an element of randomness in action, which could explain why one action is chosen over another. Several experiments and computational studies suggest that there is competition between codes for alternative possible actions, such as movements to targets or distractors. Inhibitory links between action codes means that small random variations in the activation level of one code can overcome the activation of another code by a winner-takes-all effect, which produces one result rather than another. For example, a study found that random variation in the firing of populations of neurons in the premotor cortex before a go signal could predict which of two possible responses an animal would make. Voluntary action is conditioned responding. Third, memory has a key role in determining action choices. In certain or ambiguous situations, we generally do what was successful before in similar situations, or even repeat errors that we made previously. However, memories for previous stimuli and the reward values of their associated actions effectively reduce voluntary actions to stimulus-driven actions in which the animal responds to internal trace of the stimulus after some delay. Perhaps for this reason, autobiographical memory does not figure in cognitive theories of volition, although it plays a major part in psychological accounts of individual behavior, notably in clinical psychology. Voluntary actions as goal-directedness. Finally, several accounts of voluntary action propose a teleological pull. These theories typically stress a strong linkage between cognitive representations of the goal of an action and the internal motor signal that caused the action. For example, ideomotor theories in cognitive psychology suggest that actions are represented in terms of their goals in the external world. However, teleological theories are at risk of dualistic thinking. If thinking about pressing a button really triggers a button press movement of my finger, then there should be some account of the mechanism by which conscious states cause brain activity. On the other hand, teleological theories fit well with associative accounts of operant action. An animal exploring its environment readily learns that an arbitrary action can produce rewarding outcomes. More of a conditioned stimulus elicits the same behavior as an unconditioned stimulus. A pigeon will peck at a response key as if it were food rather than just a means of acquiring food. This process, auto-shaping, suggests that representation of the goal is indeed activated anticipatorily during action. Teleological pull also appears in recent computation models that couple motor prediction to motor planning. Typically, action control begins with sensory description of a goal state. Multiple inverse models generate motor command candidates that aim to achieve this state. The commands are passed from each inverse model to paired forward model that predicts their consequences. The actual motor command is a weighted sum of the output of the inverse models. Models with predictions that are closer to the desired state receive higher weightings, and weightings can be biased by external contextual information. So, for example, if a to-be-grasped object is recognized as a cactus, the inverse model for delicate precision grip is given higher weight than if not so recognized. This comes interesting close to the role of memory and voluntary action. Such models are teleological in two ways. They initiate action by evoking an external goal, and they select between action candidates by evoking their external effects. Direct neural tests of teleological models can be difficult. However, they do make a key prediction about the brain, namely that areas and circuits for planning voluntary movement should overlap with those for imagery and counterfactual thinking about the external world. Although fMRI studies confirm the frontal motor areas, such as the pre-SMA, are involved both in action planning and motor imagery, thinking about external events and effects may involve affective rather than sensory-motor regions of the prefrontal cortex. So volition and consciousness. Voluntary actions are accompanied by specific subjective experiences. Indeed, the relationship between these experiences and the brain activity that occur before and during actions has been a key focus of the neuroscience of volition. The phenomenal experience of aroma actions is often not strong. Psychologists often comment that motor control is automatic and unconscious. Nevertheless, the experience of making a voluntary action is clearly different from that of an equivalent passive movement that is applied to the body. As Wickens said, what is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm? More importantly, the conscious intention to make an action seems to cause the action itself. We feel we have free will. Most neuroscientists are suspicious of this idea because it implies a ghost in the machine. Rather, both conscious intention and physical movement might be consequences of brain activity. Wegner, for example, has proposed that human mind assumes a causal path from conscious intention to action in order to explain the correlation between them. In fact, the correlation occurs because both conscious intention and action are driven by a common cause, namely the neural preparation for action. A more radical view suggests that conscious intention is not a bona fide mental state at all, but rather an inference that is retrospectively inserted into a stream of consciousness as the hypothetical cause of the physical movement in our body. This view receives support from studies of psychosis, in which experience of intention are associated with unusual causal explanations of connection between events. Even in the healthy brain, the consequence of action can be strongly influence the experience of the action itself. This influence is a particularly strong case of action arrows, in which feedback carries information about unexpected consequences of action. Figure 4. We have the neural events, motor preparation, movement, sensory effect, causing conscious experience of intention, action, outcome. The binding process of prediction and reconstructive inference, the action representation, sense of voluntary control, I did that, to the self-representation, the self is an agent who actually does something. So cognitive processes that underlie the experience of voluntary action Neural signals that contribute to the experience of voluntary action include advanced preparation of actions, reafferent somatosensory feedback, and sensory information about the effects of the action. The bottom level, the separate experience caused by these signals. At the second level, they're synthesized to produce an overall impression of an action as a single event. Two specific cognitive processes contribute to the synthesis. At the third level, first intentions predict the action and the goal effects to which they refer, in the green lines. Secondly, the sensory experience of the action and its effect trigger a reconstruction of the intention to act, the red lines. These processes bind together the various components of experience to produce an awareness of the action as a whole, compressed in time relative to underlying neural process. The fourth level, this is term produces a representation of the self as an agent that is capable of fluent voluntary control at the top level. Fascinating. So in addition to the experience of intention, voluntary actions often produce an experience of agency. This is the experience that one's voluntary action causes specific events in the outside world. Agency necessarily involves the experience of external sensory consequences, whereas intention relates more closely to preparation and effort. The neural basis of agency remains unclear. Explicit attributions of sensory effect to one's own action or to another agent involve the parietal cortex, but the normal implicit sense of one's own agency might involve predictions derived from intentions that are generated in the frontal motor areas. Here I focus primarily on the experience of intention rather than agency. The features of conscious intention. In fact, voluntary action is linked to two quite different forms of conscious experience: long-range thoughts about future actions and immediate feelings of being about to do something. Long-range intentions resemble plans and conscious deliberations and are linked to prospective memory. They also lack specific motoric information. Rather, they involve mental time travel as a scheduling process that is similar to task selection. Current scientific research in long-range intentions focuses on identifying the brain mechanisms of prospective memory and also involves comparative studies that investigate whether non-human animals show forethought. Short-range intentions are closer to the present topic of voluntary action. They are often described in the literature as urges, although conscious intention seems a more appropriate term. The experience of conscious intention has attracted considerable scientific interest, but clear descriptions of the phenomenology have been attempted only recently. There are at least three aspects to the phenomenal content of conscious intention: timing, effector specificity, and intensity. Conscious intentions seem to occur during the brief window approximately 1 second before movement onset. They include specific details about the body part involved and the movement that will occur. Finally, conscious intentions clearly come by degrees. One can be barely conscious that one is going to take the next step when walking, but intensely aware of pulling a trigger. The intensity dimension of a conscious intention has hardly been studied experimentally. However, clinical studies of patients with tic disorders describe premonitory urges, the intensities of which increase before the tic behavior begins. Interesting, these urges are body part specific and can even have a sensory character. The timing of conscious intentions has been studied to clarify the causal relations between consciousness and thought, brain activity, and voluntary movement. In Leavitt's well-known experiment, participants make voluntary hand movement at a time of their own choosing and later report the reading that the clock showed when they first experienced the urge to move. Although the experiment raises several methodological concerns, the results suggest that conscious intentions is experienced a few hundred milliseconds before the action occurs, because the brain preparation for such actions, as measured by readiness potentials, frequently begins at 1 second or before the action occurs. The conscious intention cannot be the cause of the neural preparation or the action. The experiment is sometimes considered neuroscientific disproof of the concept of free will, although the conceptual details of this argument are hotly disputed. Could the conscious intention to move be part of the psychological narrative which participants create to explain why their hand suddenly moved? Certainly, the events that occurred after action contribute to the experience of intention. However, best evidence suggests retrospective interpretation comes from studies in which the motor areas of the brain are artificially stimulated as part of the neurosurgical treatments. For example, when Frith and colleagues stimulated the pre-SMA, patients reported an urge to move a specific part of the contralateral body as they had not yet actually moved. This could be retrospective intervention when more intense stimulation was applied through the same electrodes. The corresponding part of the patient's body indeed moved on 5 of the 6 stimulations that were reported as producing both urge and movement. It is unclear whether the urge reported by the patients resembled the normal conscious experience of intending to act. Moreover, the experience evoked by stimulation might arise not in the pre-SMA itself, but in remote areas connected to it, such as the parietal cortex. However, such studies do at least suggest that a conscious experience akin to intention is part of the normal neural preparation for voluntary action. So Libet's approach has been extended to investigate the content of neural basis of intention. So Haggard and Eimer asked participants to choose voluntary between left and right key press actions in a modified version of Libet's task. They show that judgments of conscious intention correlate not only with the onset of midline readiness potential, but with the onset of lateralized readiness potential, the later phase of preparation in which brain activity contralateral to the selected hand exceeds ipsilateral activity. This result confirmed that experience of consciousness intention is tied to specific body movement that is prepared rather than to general preparation to move. Another study recently reported mind-reading version of the same experiment that used fMRI. They identified patterns of brain activation before movement that best predicted whether participants would perform a forthcoming action with the left or right hand, in addition to activations of pre-SMA and contralateral motor cortices, which were predicted by readiness potential findings. They found patterns of activation in the frontopolar cortex that predicated participants' choices 8 seconds before the action itself was performed. These patterns may represent an early stage in the causal chain that generates actions. Neural processes such as the readiness potential must clearly have antecedent causes, and more sensitive measurement techniques may reveal the earlier stages in this change. Alternatively, these very early activations might be associated with forethought and longer range conscious intention, as the brain areas are known to be involved in prospective memory. Although the instructions in such experiments typically tell participants to decide spontaneously, if such a thing is possible, prior deliberation cannot easily be excluded. Libet himself suggested that the interval between conscious intention and the movement onset was sufficient to allow a process of conscious veto, which would inhibit an impending action before execution. Such free will wouldn't have the philosophical advantage of salvaging traditional concepts of moral responsibility. However, dualism about conscious veto is just as problematic as dualism about conscious initiation of action. It is unclear how conscious veto might influence brain activity. Moreover, the veto, like the conscious intention, could itself be a consequence of some preceding unconscious neural activity. The process of voluntary inhibition of voluntary action are demonstrated in the recent neuroscientific studies of prefrontal cortex. These processes might provide the final check or late weather decisions before voluntary actions. They might be associated with specific conscious experience, both of the impending action and decision to abandon it, but they do not play any unusual or dualistic form of the mind-brain causation. So let's see the pre-SMA, the key structure for voluntary action. So a conscious intention, action inhibition. So while being tested, the patient spotted an apple and a knife left on purpose in the corner of a testing desk. He peeled the apple and ate it. The examiner asked why he was eating the apple. He replied, well, it was there. Are you hungry? No. Well, a bit. Have you not just finished eating? Yes. Is the apple yours? No. And whose apple is it? Yours, I think. So why are you eating it? Because it is here. So the pre-supplementary motor area, pre-SMA, is located between the cognitive areas of the frontal lobes and the motor execution areas. I've seen the diagram, such as the SMA proper in the primary motor cortex. It occupies a key position in the frontal network that transforms thoughts into actions. Direct stimulation of the pre-SMA through electrodes produces both a feeling of conscious urge to move and a higher level movement of the corresponding limb. However, many neurological studies suggest that the main function of the pre-SMA is to inhibit actions rather than to cause them. Lesions in this area can produce automatic execution of actions in response to environmental triggers. For example, when the patient sees a cup, they will reach for an attempt to drink it, even if they do not wish to. So studies in animals and humans suggest 2 further roles of the pre-SMA, which seem to be quite different from its role in voluntary action. Single neurons in the monkey pre-SMA code for the preparation of an entire complex sequence of movements, and also code for transitions between movements within the sequences. Transcranial magnetic stimulation studies in humans also indicated a role for the pre-SMA in the preparation of entire sequences, but not in transitions within sequences. The brain area that allow voluntary control of action also seem to combine individual actions into more complex ones. Volition may have arisen as a result of the capacity for increasing complex action. This suggestion receives support from the classic finding that monkeys with lesions of Brodmann's area 6, including the pre-SMA, are unable to flexibly adjust the pattern of their movements when they fail to achieve a goal. Instead, the monkeys repeatedly make the same stereotype in unsuccessful action. Thus, voluntary action is largely a matter of finding convenient ways to get actions to fulfill current goals. So what's responsibility for action? All known human cultures have the concept that an individual is responsible to society for the action. This in turn rests on the concept of volition. Individuals control their own actions, and their conscious knowledge for what they are doing should allow them to choose between right and wrong actions. Thus, in systems based on Roman law, committing a crime generally requires both a physical action and the conscious experience of performing the action. Mens rea. Views on the psychology of intention and action are thus ingrained in the language that is used to discuss morality and responsibility. However, the links between consciousness and intention, physical action, and responsibility are both problematic and highly important. Intention without action is sometimes sufficient for responsibility and sometimes not. For example, it is widely held in thought alone is not a crime. Someone who wants to hit another person but holds back at the last moment is not acting and therefore cannot be responsible. In other situations, preparation that is relevant to an action can be thought sufficient for responsibility, even if the planned action is prevented. Recent terrorism trials provide a topical example. Equally, action without intention is sometimes judged sufficient for responsibility and sometimes not. A person may be judged not guilty of an action that is clearly committed if they were not consciously aware of their actions, such as sleepwalking, assault. Although neuroscientific descriptions of the brain circuits that generate action and conscious awareness can contribute an evidence-based theory of responsibility, it is unclear whether they can capture all the nuances of our social and legal concepts of responsibility. This review has resisted the traditional philosophical idea that conscious thoughts cause voluntary actions in favor of neuroscientific model of decisions about action in relatively unconstrained situations. How might this model relate to responsibility? The initial whether decision based on reasons and motivations for action, the final check before action are both highly relevant to responsibility. By contrast, decisions regarding how and when an action is performed are less crucial. Responsibility might depend on the reason that triggered the neural process culminating in action and on whether a final check should have stopped the action. Interesting, both decisions have strong normative element. Although a person's brain decides the actions that they carry out, culture and education teach people what are acceptable reasons for action, what are not, and when a final predictive check should recommend withholding action. Culture and education therefore represent powerful learning signals for the brain's cognitive motor circuits. A neuroscientific approach to responsibility may depend not only on the neural processes that underlie volition, but also on the brain system that gives an individual the general cognitive capacity to understand how society constrains volition and how to adapt appropriately to those constraints. A basic level of functioning of the social brain as well as the cognitive motor brain is essential for a conventional concept of responsibility for action. Conclusion, future directions. Voluntary action is one of the most characteristic features of the human brain. Modern neuroscience rejects the traditional dualist view of volition as a causal chain from conscious mind or soul to the brain of the body. Rather, volition involves brain networks making a series of complex open decisions between alternative actions. The pre-SMA is a key node in the network of areas that contribute to these decisions. Furthermore, investigations should focus on decisions to inhibit voluntary actions and the contribution of predictive monitoring. These decisions involve a medial prefrontal area anterior to the classical pre-SMA. One reason for the neuroscience's lasting fascination of volition is the central role of conscious experience in voluntary action. This is now being studied systematically as an important brain datum. Whereas the heyday of behavioralism is dismissed as a mere illusion, future neuroscientific work could benefit from the development of rigorous approaches to the phenomenological of action, including better measurements of conscious experience. Neuroscientists study systems by the classical engineering principle of intervening to control inputs and then measuring inputs. Only a few special situations, such as neurosurgical exploration of the brain, computer interfacing, allow interventive control of the human voluntary motor system. Well-designed scientific studies that use these situations could provide new insights into the volitional brain. Finally, modern neuroscience is shifting towards a view of voluntary actions being based on specific brain processes rather than being a transcendental feature of human nature. This will have important ethical implications for the interactions between brain science and wider society, and will inform decisions at a societal level about individual responsibility. Okay, so that's going to conclude today's esoteric duvidism. I only have one thing left that I'm going to read through, which is 2016, Towards Solving the Hard Problem of Consciousness, the Varieties of Brain Resonance and the Conscious Experience They Support, by Grossberg, an overview of all of the recent evidence regarding consciousness coming from the brain. And you have these slides on linguistics, and then we'll get into the more religious topics. So this was a great overview, almost 40 hours of this, a lot of information, like almost overwhelming how much there is to know. And but over this period, we did cover basically all the major elements of scientific understanding of consciousness. The different concepts, emotion, volition, the brain is a predictive machine, overviews of all these different things multiple times, getting the terms and keys. And the main thing I wanted to do was these papers where I was going to go over the most recent scientific understandings of human consciousness. So I'm glad to have completed this task, and I got one more tomorrow, and there'll be a pretty full overview. So I'm happy to have done this. I feel I've gained quite a bit. I could feel smarter in the culmination of my whole adult lifetime of research into the subject, to put it all together, kind of form the framework to understand the complete concept and see the current state of research. And so I'll fine-tune, give an overview of religious history and conscious studies, and then possibly I'll move on to Freemasonry or some of my own conclusions. So I appreciate everyone who stuck with me through this. I hope you've gained from it, and hopefully I'll be back tomorrow with the conclusion in linguistics and the overview of all the evidence from the that consciousness could arise from the brain. So shalom, Hare Krishna, namaste, blessings.